Levels in Sonic games. I'm sure you're familiar with them. They take form in some of the most iconic locations in the Sonic universe, like Green Hill, Rooftop Run, City Escape, you name it. However, how familiar are you with the ones that never saw the light of day, or with the early versions of the stages that did? Not much, I'd guess. As such, today, we'll be taking a look at some cut and unused levels from the Sonic franchise, mainly from the mainline games, and some spin-offs I think have interesting things to cover, be they left in the game files in prototypes or in concept art that never was more than that. I want to thank everyone that contributed to the Sonic Wiki, Sonic Retro, the Cutting Room Floor and Hidden Palace, as well as those who posted footage online of some of the stuff I'll be covering, and also those that personally helped me and gave me information, all of whom are probably being shown on screen now, so thank you a ton. So, let's take a look at some of these stages. If you're familiar with my channel, you might be thinking, well, haven't you covered a bunch of these in your cut and unused content, prototypes and development videos? Yeah, I have. However, since a lot of those videos were made, there has been a lot of new stuff discovered that's very interesting to mention, and it also gives me an opportunity to cover some games I haven't covered in that style yet. It's also convenient to have discovered in a compilation like this. Finally, I won't really be focusing on early versions of levels in betas and prototypes, which only differences are the object layouts, so where rings, springs, enemies, etc. are placed. Without further ado, let's take a look at Sonic 1. The game was first shown at the Tokyo Toy Show in June 1990, a full year before its final release, being present at Sega's booth. The demo of the game features Sonic running through an early level that would eventually become Green Hill Zone. While it does look familiar when you look at the foreground, the background is nothing like the final, featuring large mountains and unusual blue structures, which would most likely be rock formations, but can also be blue buildings based on some of Naoto Oshima's concept arts, as you can see on the right. The blue tone of the sky is also inconsistent throughout the multiple images we have of this level due to the varying quality, but it does seem to be different from the Green Hill we eventually got. The magazines that covered this demo said that the game featured a whopping 7 layers of parallax scrolling, including the palm trees and boulders in the foreground, as well as the clouds, which overlap everything on screen. Speaking of the foreground, it also featured some other rocks, which were removed most likely to improve visibility. The palm trees also look different. This level would have a hopping blue enemy sporting red gloves. The concept for this enemy is also present in that concept art I just showed you, however the color palette is entirely different. Also very well known, the sign saying "You are welcome, never open", which does not appear in the final game and is missing from every prototype we've discovered so far. Considering how multiple magazines depict the exact same run of the stage, it's presumable that it was a recorded demo. However, Yuji Naka stated in a 2011 interview with Games Radar that it was, quote, something that was playable. The game was further shown at multiple events, adverts and programs until its release. We can divide these builds we don't have access to into the pre-winter computer electronic show builds, WCES for short, and the actual WCES builds. Besides these, different builds were also featured afterwards, but with barely any differences that are worth mentioning, so we'll restrict ourselves to these two. Let's start by the ones preceding WCES. First, the Computer Chronicles 1991 WCES event. You might be thinking, what? Okay, so the WCS event actually showed 2 versions of the game. The actual unique build shown in the event, which will be covered afterwards, and another one that's just shown as a B-roll and isn't directly related to the version of the game seen at the event, which predates the latter. As far as differences related within the level itself though, only the shade of the water and the sky appear to be different, as well as the sunflowers having purple centers, eventually being changed to green. Secondly, the build featured in the 4th issue of the Sega Visions magazine from April/May 1991. The differences here are much like the previous build, different sky and water tones and a different flower center. Otherwise, many objects are still missing, reflecting the still very early state of the game's development. As for Marble Zone, it's finally revealed for the first time. The interior background is all dark, missing torches, and it features a horizontal spiked chandelier, which goes unused in the final but appears to be working here. Spring Yard is also shown, with a different level design as is to be expected. Besides featuring different enemies, both the foreground and especially the background look very different. There are a few more builds shown before WCES, but none that feature any notable differences. So let's take a look at the WCES builds. While it does look much closer to the final, it still features some noteworthy differences. Starting by Green Hill, the background design is much closer to the final, yet it still features brighter tiles and uses the title screen's water palette cycle, which is different in the actual level in the final. The background itself is also set lower than the final game, which causes it to abruptly cut at some point. The stage would have a weird boulder in it for some reason, which first appearance would be here, and the fight with Eggman features no waterfall in the background due to the different chunk order. As for Labyrinth Zone, it's first shown here and only features a single screenshot. Here we can see an empty version of Act 2, where the crystals look different and it seems that the level doesn't even have a background yet. As for Marble Zone, we get the first look at the outside area of the level. Here you can clearly see red UFOs in the background for whatever reason. This object is non-interactable and was removed from the final game, however it was found in a prototype. Even so, it was green there, not red. The lava in the level looks much different compared to the final. It looks arguably better, having much more detail. There's also a picture of Act 3 that appears to have no object layout yet. As for Spring Yard, there are multiple chunks that never made it into the final game. Other pictures show the early background and layout design better, seeming like an almost completely different stage. As for Scrap Rain, the background appears to be completely broken, as is probably most of the level itself, considering how some chunks are noticeably incorrect. Lastly, for the special stage, the layout is different and the blocks are all yellow instead of multicolored. And as I've mentioned before, Sonic 1 has a prototype depicting the game midway through development. It was dumped by Buckaroo and released by DRX on the 1st of January 2021. This prototype features an unused level. The area of Green Hill used for the ending cutscene has a map of chunks that don't really fit any zone, nor does it align with the stage layout from this build. Based on the overall structure, it appears to be a really early level layout for Green Hill, being clearly unfinished in many aspects. There's also an unused palette for the stage, which appears to be near identical to the results screen in the Mega Play version of the game. The levels featured here also have a lot of differences compared to the final. Starting by Green Hill, the boulder is actually featured here. It's pretty buggy and doesn't really do anything, but it's here. The prototype used 3 unique backgrounds for each act, while the final game only uses one, appearing to be based on the one for Act 3. Besides that, there are a ton of object layout differences, but it mostly boils down to different or missing enemy / ring / spring / platform / checkpoint positioning. The level plays largely the same, but is a bit harder considering the lack of objects. Some chunks also go unused and others had their designs changed, but nothing too crazy. As for Marble Zone, the stage has very slightly different tones of pink due to the palette also being slightly different. At this point, the UFOs are still present in the stage background. However, instead of being red like we've seen before, they are now green and more detailed. The horizontal spike chandelier is also present here in all its glory. Besides that, most differences just include a different object layout, with different enemy placement and such, as well as no checkpoints being present, with spikes standing in their place. However, the second half of Act 2 and 3 got a near complete makeover. Regarding the former, the ending section is much simpler, basically being a direct staircase to the outside, but the early version saw you do a bit more platforming. As for the latter, the prototype originally had 2 paths to the top, but the final game changed it to one single section. As for Spring Yard, oops, excuse me, I meant Sparkling Zone, not Spring Yard. Yeah, besides everything else, this stage originally had a completely different name, which is reflected in its background, featuring a city backdrop with tons of neon signs and futuristic looking buildings during nighttime. The final version features, well, a yard, as well as an obscure city in the background, featuring a mountainous backdrop at dusk. Much like Marble Zone, the hues of pinks used here are different. Besides that, most differences are in the object layout, and nothing too interesting at that. Speaking of which, there's an unreferenced object layout for this stage left over in the files, presumably for Act 1. It seemingly matches up with the layout seen in the screenshots of the pre-WCS and WCS builds. As for Labyrinth Zone, the palette used in the prototype is slightly different, and has an unused cycling code for it meant for the water, which looks different from the final one. However, this palette also affects the blue crystals and the light shining through in the background, which is unintended. Yeah, the light shining through in the background. The background image is completely different at this point and clearly wasn't designed with vertical looping in mind. Act 3 just has no background at all. Also, there are no objects or water in the level yet, making the stage impossible to complete normally. Additionally, brick wall tiles can be seen around the level, which aren't seen in the final. The final release usually features water bubbles in these sections, suggesting they were originally air pockets before the bubble mechanic was introduced. Further proof of this is the fact that the underwater palette used in the final game doesn't affect these tiles at all. Pillar decorations are also completely missing. Besides that, most differences just include some weird chunks of terrain and some areas of the stages being weirdly barren and undeveloped at this point in time, as well as the height of the floor and ceiling being different in some segments. Most of the access structure is almost identical to the final one. The stage does feature a very weird weird unused chunk however, just featuring a yellow box and a black line. This chunk ID is used for the conveyor belts in the final game. Some other used chunks in the final are also completely empty here. As for Starlight, this stage, while graphically similar to the final, has very unfinished layouts. The prototype version has a ton of tricky platforming segments, featuring small platforms with fans that turn on and off. These sorts of small floating pieces of land are nowhere to be seen in the final game. Also, the bottom part of all the paths originally had those metal struts that show that the area is still in construction, giving it a bit more detail. Most of these were removed in the final, for whatever reason. While the start of Act 2 is almost identical between both versions, at some point it was completely redone. There's no comparison to be made really, they're just two completely different stages. The same goes for most of Act 3. There were also more bottomless pits originally and less decoration in general. Besides that, it's as I've mentioned, the object layout is still very bare bones. And finally for Scrap Brain, whoops, another mistake. I meant to say Clockwork. Yeah, this stage also had a different name. It's much like Labyrinth Zone, completely devoid of any objects and doesn't even have an Act 3 yet. The palette at this point is missing many of the colors present in the final game. Act 1 seems to have the layout seen in the early magazine screenshots, using the same background and missing a lot of chunks compared to the final, reflecting its very unfinished state. The same goes for Act 2, which is a bit more similar in general, but also becomes completely different at some point. Like, most of the act is completely different. It has nothing and a considerable number of chunks are completely broken. As you can imagine, most chunks were completely changed or slightly redesigned. Finally for Sonic 1, let's take a look at some level concepts. Firstly, a metallic stage, being described as a gleaming, gold-plated landscape with a Southeast Asian feel. This concept would later be used in Sonic Superstars in the form of Golden Capital Zone. Early art of Green Hill Zone depicts it in a way that looks very similar to the one shown at the Tokyo Toy Show in 1990, with foreground elements kind of obscuring the playable area. Japanese writing describes it as a CG-style stage, with the background consisting of a blue sky and green hills, rendered in a CG style never seen before. Another early art depicting an unknown underwater zone exists, showing Sonic performing a move he never did, bouncing on water. The Japanese writing confirms the mentioned setting, with Japanese-style rocky hills with underwater sections. The illustration shows how the character can spin to move across the surface of water. There will be various courses to choose from, dependent on skill. You can also see a city in the background with a structure that sort of looks like the Eiffel Tower. Another unknown marble zone-like stage was planned, which probably ended up being marble. Well, in that stage you'd be able to burrow through the terrain, being described as a quaking landform stage. The ground is made from a primordial material which shakes and trembles. Yes, another unknown stage, this time taking place in space, where Sonic would have a higher jump height. It also depicts a scrapped two-player mode which was eventually implemented in Sonic 2. It's obvious that this concept would eventually become Starlight. A scrap level called Chinese World also exists, being described as a Great Spirit World themed stage, based off of a China-like place. The obstacle depicted here with the fireballs was actually implemented into Spring Yard, although the fireballs were replaced with spike balls. Here is another scrap level, an unknown laboratory zone, just kinda being science-themed. It's described as a laboratory instrument-like stage, placing the pipe to spin through it, whatever that means. And lastly, an early concept of Scrap Brain, showing a city in the background. The Japanese writing describes it as a megalopolis stage, going through tricky gimmicks to advance. Now let's take a look at Sonic 2. Along with the initial reveal of the game, several mock-ups of what the game was intended to look like were released. These included a screenshot of Emerald Hill with an off-center Sonic and using the Green Hill Zone clouds and Sonic 1's HUDs, 3 early mock-ups of what was intended to be Hidden Palace Zone, and the only known shot of Sand Shower Zone, a stage that never made it into the final game, but we'll take a very good look at it a bit later. A few more screenshots were released, though not too many interesting things are seen there. However, in some specific ones of Aquatic Ruin, you can see that the stage was called Neo Green Hill, or rather Neo Green Bubble Sprite. Another pre-release image shows a completely different looking Casino Night, with both a different background, foreground and level design, but we'll also take a deeper look at that in a bit. The special stage was also revealed in what seems like an unfinished state, having a different design. There exist quite a few footages and promotional videos showcasing some early versions of Sonic 2. However, I won't really cover them as we actually have access to the prototypes themselves, even if if some builds shown there are different, they mainly only feature layout differences compared to both the final game and the prototypes themselves. With that being said, let's take a look at the earliest prototype we have access to, the Nick Arcade build from somewhere in late May 1992. This build still has many remnants from Sonic 1, being very incomplete with missing enemies and levels, and tons of graphical issues. It was dumped by the RX and released to the public on the 7th of November 2006. The build has this name since it's the version showcased in the last 4 episodes of the game show Nick Arcade, appearing to be very close to, if not identical to, the one shown there. So let's take a look at the stages here, starting by Green Hill. As I've mentioned, it's a Sonic 1 leftover. The level is completely identical to the one in Sonic 1, except if it had broken collision and glitched graphics. There's not much to it really, it's just pretty broken. Speaking of Sonic 1 leftovers, Labyrinth Zone. Here the stage uses Chemical Plant styles, Labyrinth's rippling, and Marble's ring layouts, being completely broken due to it trying to use Green Hill's chunk format. It's unclear what this level ID was meant to be though. You can also load into Final Zone, which uses Hilltop's graphics because that stage uses the same ID at this point that Scrap Brain used. Considering how Sonic 1's Final Zone uses Scrap Brain's assets, this makes sense. Sonic 1's ending scene can also be accessed, using Green Hill's arts and palette and Chemical Plant's layouts. As a result, it's very much completely broken, since most of what makes it up is garbage data left over in the ROM. As for Emerald Hill, at this point in development, it's the only beatable zone. It features a cut snail badnik that slowly moves around on the ground, and charges at the player when it sees them. Besides that, it doesn't have much to it. Most of the level design is near identical to the final, and the object layout does feature a lot of differences, but nothing too interesting to mention besides that. As for Chemical Plant, the background has a pink tint rather than the olive green seen in the final. A few of the buildings are different, mostly some that were short and wide being changed to tall and thin. The background itself is shorter in the prototype and has less steel beams and missing squared blue lights. Act 1 has a really different level design compared to the final game, as with Starlight they're so far apart that you can't really compare them at all. Act 2 is identical to Act 1 for whatever reason, so it probably wasn't done yet. As for Hidden Palace, it's there, I guess. It's similar to the one seen in the 2013 re-release, but besides that, there isn't anything too interesting about it that isn't seen there. The only real cool thing is that the underwater palette used here is the same as Labyrinth's, which looks fine enough on Sonic but horrendous on Tails. As for Hilltop, the level design for Act 1 is completely done and is identical to the final. However, since this zone occupies the ID formerly done so by Scrap Brain, and due to the lower screen bound not being changed, you can't finish the act at all. Similarly, while Act 2 also looks near identical to the final, it can't be completed because when the camera goes past a certain X coordinate, it tries to read data that's not meant to be read the way it tries to, causing it to just read garbage data and crash the game. Also, if you fall off the level, you load into Scrap Brain Act 3, which looks completely broken as well. Besides that, the level mostly has a different object layout with nothing too interesting. And as for the special stages, it still uses code from Sonic 1's special stage and crashes under normal circumstances. As you can imagine, the visuals are all missing, though everything else works correctly. Next is the Simon Y prototype. While it is further into development than the Nick Arcade build, it's still pretty unfinished, featuring levels not seen in the final, as well as one seen there but not in the previous build. It was built on August 1992 and released sometime in 1998, being named after Simon Y, who found it on a Chinese GeoCities page. Yuji Naka has stated that it came from a demo cart that was stolen from a New York toy fair in 1992. Firstly, let's take a look at the level order. The Nick Arcade prototype still used many level IDs taken from Sonic 1. However, the Simon Y build almost completely changes them, adding a ton of new zones and shuffling the ID of some. Emerald Hill now occupies the same slot as Green Hill, whereas previously it occupied Starlights, which goes unused in the final game. Labyrinth is removed. Chemical Plant occupied Marble Zone's ID, getting a completely new one. However, in its place, a level called Wood Zone, not implemented in the final game at all, is present here, which we'll take a look at in a bit. The final game only really has some leftovers, mainly the color palette, the starting position, object data, music ID, and not much else. The stage does reference data where it once was, but since it doesn't exist anymore, it results in glitched graphics, no objects, and Metropolis's music playing. Hidden Palace was moved to a different ID, which is now occupied by Acts 1 and 2 of Metropolis, with the same happening with Hilltop, which slot is now occupied by Metropolis Act 3. All other levels gain their own IDs. However, there are still some interesting things. Mainly, the slot occupied by Mystic Cave in the final is instead used by Dust Hill, which is Mystic Cave. It just had another name that didn't fit it at all for whatever reason. The slot that Death Egg occupies here is instead occupied by Sky Chase in the final, which doesn't exist in this build yet. However, the slot that Death Egg would use in the final game is used here by the infamous Genocide City. Okay, but what about the actual levels? Since they have their own IDs here and Hidden Palace is an actual stage, then they surely are somewhat playable, right? Well, more or less. The deleted slot for Labyrinth Zone is just an empty stage using Emerald Hill's palette and music. Wood Zone, however, does have some things, though sadly it didn't get too far into development. What exists of it quickly ends because of a ramp that has a solid platform blocking its top. Even if you get past it with debug mode, the rest of the stage is incomplete. The background is also located under the stage for whatever reason. The ID used by Starlight and previously used by Emerald Hill is also completely empty, using Emerald Hill's palette and playing Oil Ocean's music. Wing Fortress is also absent in this build, but you can still access the ID used by it in the final game. Of course, it doesn't have anything, but it does load Casino Nights Act 2 palette. Hidden Palace, despite changing ID, has barely seen any changes made to it. The 09 ID is unused in all known versions of this game, however, loading into it will use Emerald Hill's palette and Sky Chase's music. So, it's finally time for Genocide City, and it's completely empty. It uses Chemical Plant's music and Emerald Hill's palette, and that's it. At this point, all the graphics used by it were already removed and were reused for the third level of Sonic Spinball. And loading into the newly added Death Egg also presents a completely empty stage. Okay, let's take a look at the actual level differences. Most of them are also layout differences, so it won't be that long. Also, most Act 2s cut off just before the boss area. Emerald Hill is still known in this build as Green Hill, and that's it really. Chemical Plant has a different underwater palette, and that's pretty much it as well. Aquatic Ruin is still called Neo Green Hill. It also has some palette differences that make grey-blue colors look darker. Casino Night still looks very different. It has no object layout and uses the old look we've seen. While the level design somewhat resembles the final Casino Night, there are many differences that make it hard to compare them to each other. At this point, you can assume that it's still a pretty much completely different stage. Hilltop is much further into development compared to the Nick Arcade builds. What didn't work then mostly works now, and the level doesn't have weird scrap brain oddities left over in it. As always, it features a lot of object layout differences, but the level design is identical to the final. As for Mystic Cave, whoops, wrong again, I meant to say Dust Hill. Yep, the level is still known as this at this point. I'm sure you're thinking that this name may be a remnant of that desert level I've shown before. Apparently, early concepts for the game literally just confirmed that this was the original name for this very concept of this stage for whatever reason. None of the acts can be completed as neither have a signpost. The level design is also identical to the final, but Act 2 is missing the ceiling, not really feeling like a cave. Oil Ocean has ball launchers, which go unused in the final game but are abundant here. Besides object layout differences, some chunks are also different and less detailed, but that's pretty much it. Finally, for Metropolis, the early background uses an orange color scheme instead of the blue-gray one seen in the final. It also includes blocks not seen in the final, such as conveyor belts. The level design itself is still quite different at this point, being a bit simpler and more straightforward. Besides that, a lot of assets were redesigned to fit the atmosphere better. The rest of the prototypes don't really have any more interesting differences besides the following. In the September 14th, 1992 build, Casino Night has already reached its final design, although it still has a ton of object layout differences. And the Sensor prototype, originally released by the group of the same name on November 9th, 1992, which was forgotten until the 14th of February 2019, when it was rediscovered by the RX and Evil Ham Wizards. It has a still very incomplete Death Egg and Wing Fortress, and Hidden Palace is already in the process of being removed. All of the stages we've seen also have some leftovers in the final game. The A1 slot used by Labyrinth Zone in the Nick Arcade prototype is now an empty level slot. However, if you load into it, you're presented with a copy of Emerald Hill Act 1 devoid of any objects, using Tails' life icon, much like the other scrap stages we'll take a look at. The O2 slot used for Wood Zone still has a few remnants, mainly its palette, starting position, object data, and other minor stuff. It references data that once existed, but since it doesn't anymore, it results in glitched graphics and no objects. Another empty slot, being ID03, is basically identical to the same one used by the old Labyrinth Zone. Hidden Palace here, ID01, SA1 has practically completely been removed. What remains of it is the object layout, palette and palette cycling, but nearly everything else uses Oilocean's data. While between the prototypes it has seen barely any changes, it seems that it did have a few more made to it before its removal on the sensor prototype, even adding a new object. ID09 is also a completely empty level slot. It uses garbled Emerald Hill tiles and Badnik sprites from Oilocean. It also barely has any collision and references a water height that most likely pertains to the removed Hidden Palace zone. The stages also have a bunch of unused chunks, most of which do go used either on the Nick Arcade or Simon Y builds, sometimes even both. Lastly, for Sonic 2, let's take a look at concept zones. These concepts were made by Yasushi Yamaguchi and were first released as part of the Sonic the Hedgehog 25th Anniversary art book. Some of these are referenced in the early concept for Sonic 2's level order, when the game was actually meant to have time travel, a mechanic later developed for Sonic CD. Ocean Wind was meant to be the second stage after Emerald Hill, or as it's called in the original level order, Green Hill. It would have been a coastal area with piers and rock structures in the background, with some of its concepts being reused for Angel Island from Sonic 3 and Emerald Coast from Sonic Adventure. It would have occupied the old O1 slot for Labyrinth Zone in the final game. While initially simply known as Woods in the map concept art, Secret Jungle Zone was a dense jungle with Sonic running into various trees, designed by the artist Brenda Cook. It would have even featured spring branches to guide Sonic up. As we've seen, the level did see some work made to it in the Simon Y and August 21st builds, but it never went very far into development. It would occupy the O2 slot in the level index. As we've seen, the final game still has remnants of it. Another interesting thing about it though is that on the 12th of December 2023, a VHS containing a portfolio from Brenda Cook was released by the Video Game History Foundation. It included a previously unseen animated mock-up, featuring an earlier version of the conveyor belt and the levels palette, as well as animated spikes, which are absent from any prototype. She said in an interview that the level was roughly halfway done when it was scrapped, and said she remembers it having pink flowers somewhere. According to Yamaguchi, it got scrapped due to problems during the test map phase, apparently because it was difficult to express the level theme due to the graphics' capacity. Speaking of Brenda Cook's VHS, Sand Shower Zone, also simply referred to as Desert in development materials, it was a western-themed stage also designed by her. It would have occupied slot ID 03, the one identical to the removed Labyrinth Zone I mentioned. Since it was one of the earliest levels worked on, there's no concept art of it, only a mock-up using a mix of placeholder and level assets. Some assets for the level were also found on a floppy disk owned by Tom Payne, a former member of Sega Technical Institute, featuring a bunch of early assets for Sonic 2 and some other stuff. Here, those assets are using Sonic's palette. According to Brenda Cook, the assets were completed, and the map would have featured underground and above ground sections, with the level's gimmick being quicksand, similar to what was eventually done for Oilocean. According to Yamaguchi, the level was scrapped due to graphical issues with the moving sand and its space. There are also a bunch of sprites for enemies in the level in the Tom Payne archives. The level would eventually be used as inspiration for the cut Desert Dazzle from the 2011 version of Sonic CD, and later used in the form of Mirage Saloon in Sonic Mania. Tropical Sun, Tropical Plant or Tropical Summer took place on an island with waterfalls and palm trees. Based on the map documents, it would have occupied slot 05 in the level index, which is used by Metropolis Act 3. Blue Ocean or Blue Lake took place under the sea and featured an underwater cavern. It would have occupied slot 06, which is used by Wing Fortress. Emerald Hill's two-player music used ID 06 in the Simon Y prototype, which may suggest it was intended for this stage at some point. The Tom Payne archives feature some interesting things regarding this, namely a concept where ice platforms and a unique submarine mechanic are shown, seeing Sonic travel to the bottom of the ocean before exiting it and entering the underwater cavern and reaching the island surface. There are also concepts of some Batniks and objects, as well as sprites for the lobster and squid enemies. Hidden Palace features no concept, but some development materials is it called Olympus and Secret Palace. The only development image we have of it, besides the prototype builds, is the one I showed you at the start of Sonic 2's coverage, which is simply a mock-up. However, this one has a different background compared to the one seen in those builds, and only partial graphics of it remain in the Nick Arcade and Simon Y prototypes. The stage was scrapped apparently because the gimmick and boss hadn't been finalized, so they had to scrap it to meet schedule. Sonic would originally learn how to become Super Sonic here, and was reused in the 2013 version of the game as a hidden zone inside Mystic Cave, which was the original original idea to begin with. Rock World, also referred as Ice in development material, was a palette swap of Sand Shower, replacing the cacti with Christmas trees and giving it a winter theme. It would have occupied slot 09 originally, and the song for Sky Chase plays if you load into that stage in the Simon Y prototype, although the actual Sky Chase level is missing from the build, suggesting the track was originally meant for Rock World. It does kinda fit the theming, so I wouldn't think this is too far off. This level would eventually become Ice Cap from Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Madness Mountain, although unconfirmed, is believed to be an early version of what would eventually become Mystic Cave, since both feature various castle/dungeon-like stage gimmicks, including drawbridges and similar brick tiles, although the original concept looks more like Marble Zone. Emerald Isle appears to be concept art of an early Neo Green Hill, with the concept name apparently being a name given to it later into development, which was of course changed to Aquatic Ruin. Now one of the most infamous cut levels of all Sonic games, Genocide City, or Cyber City, but that name isn't nearly as crazy. Designed by Tom Payne and intended to be part of Sonic 2's finale, it was a palette swap of what we know now to be Metropolis Zone, with a more futuristic high-tech design. Tom Payne says the name's given were as a result of the teams maybe not having a full grasp of the English language, so they brought up the negative connotations the word has, since the Japanese team apparently wanted it to sound dangerous and accidentally made it sound too dangerous. The level can be selected in the Simon Y prototype, but the stage is empty, and its ID was later used for Death Egg. Level chunk designs show that the level would have contained fans, a green vertical elevator, mid-air conveyor belts, and these lined up on walls and ceilings. There are also drawings of the level design for Acts 1, 2, and 3, the latter of which is most likely a continuation of Act 2, although you can't really see anything that well. There are also concepts of some objects, namely multiple types of a fan, wheel, bear trap, and a really weird one called Bob, featuring a man's face in some sort of wall or machine or something. In the Tom Payne archives lie some sprites named Bob and Face, with some disconcerting sprites of some guy making various expressions. While we don't know if it's related to the Bob object, it's something to think about. Lastly, for Sonic 2, Death Egg concepts, originally planned as two separate zones, being Death Egg and Neo Death Egg. As you can tell by the concept, the level was meant to be a full stage and would feature an outside segment in space, which never saw the light of day. The idea was cut due to time constraints, much like Hidden Palace. Sonic 3 would, of course, expand on this idea with its actual Death Egg zone. Now let's take a look at Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Let's start by the prototypes first this time, specifically for Sonic 3. The November 3rd, 1993 build of the game is the only prototype we have of Sonic 3 and Knuckles related betas that predates the actual release of Sonic 3 and not Sonic and Knuckles, being released on the 16th of November 2019 as the finale of Hidden Palace's Sonic Month. While the ROM's data says it's from the start of November, what can actually be seen in the game points to it being from sometime in October, since the game was meant to be finished by the end of November, yet at this point it still looks very incomplete. It was built while the process of removing Sonic and Knuckles' levels was underway, so it contains a lot more leftovers of them than the final game, something we'll take a look at later. Also, all the songs used here are different from the final ones, which ended up being used for the 1997 PC port of the Sonic and Knuckles collection and Sonic Origins. Let's take a look at the actual Sonic 3 stages first. The intro for Angel Island features Sonic riding a surfboard instead of turning into Super Sonic. Knuckles also has completely different sprites and animations compared to the final. In addition to this, an early version of the final scene does exist, where most of the graphics are glitched, the tornado doesn't bob up and down while flying, and the final Knuckles object is present, but he doesn't jump to uppercut Sonic. As for the actual level, most differences are just in the object layout, and the level design is pretty much final at this point. However, the prototype seems to feature less ceilings, meaning the final game has a lot more hidden platforms and areas to collect items. Hydro City features a completely different background compared to the final game, which can be seen in the latter's level select. The level design for both acts is practically final, and only the object layout is different and some mechanics don't really work well yet. Same goes for Marble Garden. Both acts are pretty much final and only the object layout differs. Carnival Night uses a very different palette for the underwater sections, resembling more the one seen in Chemical Plant. Besides that, the level design is final, and the object layout doesn't have that many differences. Additionally, there's an unfinished transition cutscene here, where nothing happens after Knuckles lands on the switch and runs away. Launch Base, much like the final version, features 5 areas containing water that would either raise or lower the water level. This being present suggests that the level would have water at some points, as proven by the concept art, which we'll take a look at in a bit. However, the underwater palette for this is different from the unused final one, turning everything green. As for the level design, it's mostly identical in Act 1 to the final, but Act 2 features shorter paths and thus occupies less space than the final level. Now, time for Sonic and Knuckles stages. Mushroom Valley, since that's what it's called in the level select, sounds very rough at this point in development. Mainly, there's a specific instrument that's too loud and cuts all the other ones in most instances. Just take a listen. As far as the actual level goes, yeah, most of it has been completely removed. It uses Azure Lake's graphics and color palette, so of course nothing looks right. However, the stage still has some leftovers in this version. There's an unused color palette for the level, mainly featuring 2 wrong colors. The brightest white is replaced with a yellow tone, making the HUD and the rings look more yellow than they're supposed to, and the darkest shade of the ground colors being white, possibly meaning it was meant to look slightly different at one point. On screen you can see a reimagining of what the stage would have looked like, which is an interesting sight. Besides that, only the object layout remains. Considering the position of some objects, it's presumable that the level looked really different at this point in development, being much more vertical than the final version. Flying Battery, while also sounding different, sounds more like the final than Mushroom Valley did. However, it's very noticeable that there are some instruments missing and others just sound very different. It is also one of the few stages that are somewhat playable in this prototype. However, it's missing animated tiles and many objects. The background is different and matches the design seen in the level select icon, though the prototype palette is even more blue for some reason. It also becomes broken the further you progress, since it isn't programmed to loop. The level also has a bunch of unused chunks, though most of them are for the background. And as far as the level design goes, it's very different. Some sections are kind of the same, but it's noticeable that there's a lot of progress to be made here. As the paths are simpler, there are fewer alternate routes and the stage is generally shorter compared to the final. Lava Reef also sounds pretty similar to the final, however it's clearly missing a background instrument that makes it feel fuller for Act 1. Act 2 has a different tone mostly. Loading into the stage usually results in a broken mess, yet you can force it to be playable by loading leftover data from an earlier Sonic & Knuckles build. The Sonic 3 prototype contains a set of 6 identical maps for Act 1 and 1 for Act 2, which both have differences, but unfortunately no graphical data exists for the second act. The palette used here is a bit different, with the most noticeable change made for the final being the rock and pipe color. The background looks very slightly different, as the lava channels, the faraway cavern hollows, and the death egg were redrawn. The level design for Act 1 is slightly different compared to the final. While how the level plays is pretty similar, the beta stage has simpler shapes for the platforms and ceilings and, as a result, simpler paths. The leftover data for Act 2 shows a less labyrinthic stage at the start, but the layout is pretty similar to the final when you reach about halfway. The bonus stages are largely unimplemented at this point. Not much to say, honestly. The levels have a lot of missing data and don't work at all. And lastly, for the special stages, they are merely tech demos at this point and use different sprites for the spheres. It's kind of cool to look at them though, but yeah, there's nothing happening. Before looking at Sonic & Knuckles' prototypes, let's quickly take a look at what's in the final Sonic 3. Trying to load Sonic & Knuckles levels generally results in worse outcomes compared to the prototype. The only thing to cover here would be Sandopolis, which is mostly a wasteland of broken data. The same went for Ice Cap in the prototype, I just didn't talk about it because it didn't have anything worthwhile. Hydro City features some sort of placeholder shapes for the animated orbs in the columns. They can only be seen if you prevent the final graphics from loading. Now something pretty interesting. The ROM has two kinds of leftovers, one that's completely irrelevant to the game and makes a bunch of references of source codes for Star Trek The Next Generation echoes from the past, for whatever reason, and another area with some stage layouts and palette data from multiple early builds. The early Azure Lake has a different background that's more cyan and filled with flowers instead of water. I honestly think this one may even look nicer. Balloon Park would have different tones, being a lot more purple. There's also leftover placeholder art for the level design. The old Desert Palace has a slightly different level layout, and its background is missing the sand dunes. There are also placeholder art files which look ever so slightly different to the unused foreground layout. Speaking of which, Chrome Gadget only has the placeholder art. Well, 2 pieces of it to be precise. Sadly, it looks identical to the final. Same goes for Endless Mine, which layout is also identical to the final game. There are also 2 unused palette tables, one which is very old and another that is more recent than the previous, yet still pretty early into development. Only the very old one is worth covering, since the other one is mostly final and only has an early version of Ice Cap Act 2's outside palette of note. I'm also not gonna cover every single palette since not every single one has many differences. Hydro City Act 1's underwater palette wouldn't affect Sonic, and instead of having lilac bricks, they would be deep purple colored. Still on the same stage, the green foreground bricks were red, and the background ones also looked different. As for Act 2, we see mostly the same differences, as yellow and blue blocks are instead completely red, and the background is dark green instead of purple. The oldest palette doesn't have an outside palette for Ice Cap Act 2, suggesting that the level would have taken place entirely inside the cavern. Chrome Gadget's Unused palette shows an otherwise completely unseen part of the background, and now matches the final version's icon. The palette for Angel Island Act 1 here appears to be a mix of the initial beach cutscene and the forest, as if the forest background didn't exist at that point, which it probably didn't. It's theorized that this palette would be used for the early background shown in a commercial for the Game.com version of Sonic Jam, having a completely different ocean mountainous background and foreground. Besides that, there are a bunch of unused level chunks, but nothing too interesting that we haven't seen. So, time for Sonic & Knuckles. This game features 9 different prototypes, 2 from before the process of splitting the games began, so you can consider them prototypes of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and 7 of Sonic & Knuckles exclusively. However, I am very sorry to disappoint. None of these prototypes have any real differences that would have you consider them that different. I can summarize every difference like this: object layout differences, very slight level design differences, a lot of bugs, different background scrolling, broken cutscenes, different boss behavior, and that's about it. Sadly, nothing that's as interesting as what we saw in Sonic 3. However, the final Sonic & Knuckles does feature some more interesting things. There's a hidden area in Hidden Palace that is only accessible via debug modes or if you have Tails. This area has 6 power-up monitors, most likely intended for testing. While the level select shows the Doomsday Act 2 as being accessible, it is not. If you do try to load into it, you'll be presented with an otherwise completely empty level aside from some chunks of screen. And if you enter Mushroom Hill and then enter a specific action replay code, you can view remnants of Carnival Night from Sonic 3. Of course, this will cause some graphics to become corrupted, and the game will crash in the boss area since the boss data for Carnival Night doesn't exist anymore. Finally, for Sonic 3, let's take a look at some concept art and pre-release stuff. There are some very early pieces of art showing basic progression ideas for some levels. Much like Sonic 1, names for these stages were not yet conceived, and as such, most of them only have a generic description of what the setting is supposed to be. It seems that most of the act structure that made it into the final was already planned here, as there's a boss per each act for a total of 2 bosses for 2 acts, and Knuckles has access to unique paths due to his moveset, even if he himself looks pretty different at this point. This concept shows 2 zones, Woods, which would later become Angel Island, and Sewer, which is Hydro City. Angel Island was originally meant to be a wooded area instead of the tropical jungle seen in the final. The transition between the 2 stages for Knuckles was also different, as he would use an ancient ruined doorway to pass, while in the final he jumps off the bridge he's standing on. Also, the transition between Hydro City and Marble Garden is pretty much identical, except Sonic would be shot out from the side instead of the top. As a result, you'd get into Marble Garden, or Ruin as it's called here, from a waterfall. Carnival Night, called Neon, also seems much more like a theme park than a carnival setting, featuring roller coasters and Ferris wheels. Knuckles' transition between Carnival Night and Flying Battery was also different, as he wasn't meant to travel through the latter level, or at least not after the former, since he would dig into the ground and transition to Zone 5 for Rival, suggesting he'd have a unique stage here. Then we have Flying Battery, called Airship at this point. Much like the game's prototypes, Flying Battery was meant to be after Carnival Night instead of after Mushroom Hill, hence why the Sonic 3 early build still had Flying Battery in a mostly playable state. The stage was intended to be a blimp instead of the crazy-ass battleship it is in the final. The concept sheet for this stage shows no alternate path for Knuckles, so it kind of confirms that Knuckles was never meant to go through this level, much like how he doesn't have unique paths in the final. At the end of the stage, a piece of the blimp would break off and start sliding on a mountain, where a boss battle would take place. I think you know where this transition would lead. Yeah, Ice Cap, which was called Snow Mountain. Instead of the snowboarding segment, the level would have a platforming section on the outside and would then transition to the underground. Knuckles would have directly started in an underground cave filled with icicles, most likely when he completed his unique stage. Then you'd get into Modern Factory, the early name for launch base. Knuckles would travel through ancient underground ruins where Eggman's base was built over. The boss for Sonic's level is also completely different, as are most at this point. Mushroom Hill was, rather uncreatively, called Mushroom. Knuckles would get here by going through a hole in the ruins of Launch Base, while Sonic would get there from the Death Egg's falling platform. Knuckles' level would have a dragon mural, which lines up with a story described in the Japanese manual, which describes something that is not present in the final. There, Knuckles would confuse the Death Egg for the egg of a legendary dragon depicted in the murals on the altar. The level would also transition directly to Sandopolis. Sonic would get there by entering a hole in the tree and falling down to exit the trunk via another hole into Sandopolis, while Knuckles would exit a pyramid into a boss area where the mushroom forest would have grown around the surrounding pyramids, sort of like an oasis. Sandopolis follows the same naming scheme as Mushroom Hill. It's called Sand. The sketches suggest that the level would have taken place primarily inside the pyramid, as it is all depicted inside, while Act 1 in the final takes place outside. The level would start identically for both Sonic and Knuckles, except Sonic's path would fill with sand, forcing him onto a higher route, while Knuckles' wouldn't have any sand yet, forcing him down. His section ends with an annotation saying Zone 10 for Rival, yet again suggesting a unique zone. There's no proof of any concept made for this level, and considering how no stage after Sandopolis features paths for Knuckles, it is likely this Zone 10 would have been his last. Volcano was the name given to both Lava Reef and Hidden Palace, as they were meant to be a single stage. Of note is the fact that there would be a platforming set piece with falling rocks. The cutscene in Hidden Palace plays similarly to the final, except that the events that take place after the floor breaks still happen in the same stage in the final. Then you'd go into the Temple of the Sky, or Sky Sanctuary. The beginning of the zone would take place underground, with Sonic falling down from Hidden Palace and then rising up to the level through the portal along with Knuckles, while in the final they teleport separately and the teleporter itself is the stage transition. The end of the stage would see Sonic get to the Death Egg by jumping through falling debris, and then fighting a boss upside down on the underside of the hole. Since Mecha Sonic doesn't appear here, it's presumable that it wasn't planned yet. And finally we have Death Egg, being the only level with its final nomenclature. Of course, the stage takes place mostly inside it, and its end would feature a cutscene showing Sonic transforming into Super Sonic and chasing down Eggman, which would then lead to the Doomsday Zone. As you probably know, no sequence like this exists in the final, as there isn't a transition between those two zones. Besides these, there are also other concept pieces that were made to help give the levels a look and feel. Most of these are actually modified pieces of Sonic 2's own concept art, as I've mentioned before. Sadly, most of the other images are also glimpses taken from an MTV special, where a wall full of these drawings could be seen, meaning the quality isn't too great. It seems that all stages got at least one colored piece of concept art. This image is a modified version of Tropical Sun from Sonic 2, possibly depicting Angel Island. A concept depicting a pipe expelling water, most likely for Hydro City, considering the whole sewer motif early into development. Marble Garden concepts show a modified version of Emerald Sun from Sonic 2, showing that at least half of it would have taken place underwater, which of course doesn't happen in the final. Here's a concept too blurry to decipher what stage it is simply from visual input. However, considering how it's the only level where it's impossible to make out the concept zone, it can be inferred that this is launch base. A piece titled The Interior of a Blimp is clearly meant for Flying Battery, being a modified piece of concept of Metropolis from Sonic 2. Another image of this shows a description for some elements of the level, with Act 2 featuring things such as explosions and firewind. Act 1 would have also taken place at night and Act 2 at dawn. And here's Ice Cap, showing Sonic about to enter the caves with a barely readable text saying Snow-Covered Mountain. This piece of concept art depicts supports, rails and minecarts. However, no stage in Sonic 3 looks like this. With that being said, it's speculated that this is a previously unseen concept for Mystic Cave, repurposed for Carnival Night somehow, since the stage would have featured a giant roller coaster according to the early concepts. A piece titled Mushroom Forest is a clearly modified version of the Secret Jungle Zone from Sonic 2. This one, unlike the others, was somewhat redrawn instead of simply recolored. Sandopolis' concept depicts what appears to be the inside of the pyramid, also a clearly modified version of the Madness Mountain concept from Sonic 2. A piece of concept art depicting a cave with multiple stalactites, presumed to be for Lava Reef. A concept for Sky Sanctuary appears very different. While the main concept is the same, as in the floating islands connected by bridges, it looks more like Skyrail from Sonic Adventure 2. A piece depicting an outer space stage seems to line up with Death Egg, which in itself is a modified concept of the Death Egg concept from Sonic 2. And lastly for Sonic 3, a concept for Doomsday Zone shows Super Sonic fighting a dragon in space. It's deductible that this dragon would be the one in Mushroom Hill's mural. So, now let's take a look at Sonic CD, also starting by the prototypes, which sadly don't feature as many interesting differences this time around. There are 11 of them, yet not all feature any notable changes to warrant a coverage. The version 0.02 build of Sonic CD is the earliest prototype we have of it for the Sega CD, being built on the 4th of December 1992 and dumped by DRX on the 26th of October 2019. It was created for showcase at a Yusei Sega World event in Japan. At this point, nothing of the game besides the first 2 acts of Palm Tree Panic is implemented, and what is doesn't really work that well. The game is also called CD Sonic the Hedgehog at this point. Palm Tree Panic is actually called Salad Plain here, probably before they decided to give the two nouns composing the stage's name the same first letter. The palette used for all time periods is slightly different, and is actually still left over in the final game. You can't access the good future normally here, but you can do so by changing some RAM values. This is also the only known build of the game that points to the infamous Round 2, which we'll take a look at in a bit. The music used for the past is stored as CD audio instead of sequenced PCM like in the final, being the only ones that are that way, since they occupied a lot of space. Besides that, the tempo of the song is different. Besides those differences, all other ones are very minor changes to the object layout, so nothing too interesting. Now time for Prototype 510. This one was compiled on the 10th of May 1993, showcasing the game roughly halfway into its completion. While not all levels are normally accessible, all of them can be accessed via the level select and are functional. It was discovered by a group of fans called Sega Extreme in the summer of 2000. The most noticeable difference for literally every single level in the game are the flowers. Some of them are completely different compared compared to the final ones. However, what's interesting is the fact that every time period had its own palette for the flowers in every stage, while the final game simply reuses the same one for all periods. Also, generally, the levels' design is slightly different in every stage, though they don't really play that differently. The levels that can be normally accessed are Palm Tree Panic, Collision Chaos and Tidal Tempest, though only the latter features any real interesting quirks besides a different stage layout and bugs. It would have different colored water for every time period, which kinda makes sense but doesn't really fit the aesthetic all that well. Now time for the unused ones. Quartz Quadrant featured a monitor showing Sonic's face at the beginning of Act 1 in the good future, which doesn't exist in the final. In both this build and the final one is an Eggman monitor in the bad future, so it contrasts with that one. This monitor is actually used in the 2011 version in Act 3. The good future outdoors background also looks different, having a black sky, darker mountains and less refined foliage. All objects use the same design for all time periods and they have slightly different designs from the final ones, looking a bit out of place on top of using incorrect palettes. Instead of signs, the direction of the conveyor belts was controlled by buttons, which don't do anything. Also, Act 2 has no objects in the past and both futures, with the same going for Act 3. As for Wacky Workbench, the flowers are identical to the ones from Quartz Quadrant, except while that stage used horrible palettes, these ones actually don't look all that bad, the past one especially. All backgrounds have different color schemes. A lot of stuff doesn't work correctly, like the tubes and tunnels, the electrical conduits, and Sonic not curling into a ball when he bounces off the floor. As for Stardust Speedway, the flowers here would have swapped palettes to create the illusion of a transitioning color scheme, yet it just makes them look very unusual. All three acts are completely devoid of any objects. Act 1 uses the Sonic 1 title screen palette for testing the light scrolling effects for some reason. The Eggman statue that appears close in Act 2 would have appeared in Act 1's background far away, being eventually removed. There are some weird differences in the graphics in general, like some parts of the foreground in the past are blue instead of yellow, the good future has a blue color scheme with the background being blue and black, and the sky in the bad future constantly flashes red. As for Metallic Madness, it features no rings at all, the background in Act 1's past has a purple tint, the stage would have had a ton of bottomless pits, which were thankfully removed in the final game. Several objects are present here that would never see the light of day, such as this set of platforms that behave like scales, and the rest of the differences mainly include a different object layout, or lack thereof. And lastly, for this build with the special stages, it's not yet playable. In it you can read the text, "The programmer has an app, hold out, programmer," which will flash repeatedly. There are no UFOs to destroy yet. The layout appears to be an early version of the second special stage, and there are oil slicks here that were removed from the final. There is also an unused object that has no graphics and moves around in a 3D space. Whether it's supposed to be a test object or a prototype UFO is anyone's guess at this point. In addition to that, there are also two unused special stage maps which are not present in the final. All other prototypes really only feature some object layout differences, but at that point most of the stages are largely identical to what saw the light of day. As such, let's take a look at what was actually left over in the final game, mainly unused objects. Palm Tree Panic features an unused waterfall effect that pertains to an era very early to the game's development. The game normally doesn't load the intended sprites into the VRAM, so it looks heavily corrupted. However, the effect can be restored, though it doesn't look too great, as once again it was a very early idea that apparently never got that far. Collision Chaos has an unused object that acts as a teleporter, transporting you to another nearby one. They can be placed in a 510 prototype and would most likely allow you to traverse without the flippers and bumpers. Tidal Tempest has two sets of unused platforms, an electric beam and an octagon block that can never be seen. The electric beam appears in the V0.501 prototype I didn't cover, where if touched it stops. There's an unused sprite for Sonic in the files where he gets electrocuted, which could have either been used for this or Wacky Workbench, or both truthfully. Quartz Quadrant only really features some unused platforms, mainly moving ones, conveyor belt variants and a weird swinging conveyor belt. Stardust Speedway features some light edges, as in the prototype builds, instead of searchlights, a lit up palette would scroll up and down. They were meant to be placed on the edges of the highlighted area. Metallic Madness features an unused trapdoor which did appear in the prototypes, and as for special stages, by setting all three sound test selections to 7, you'll load into a secret stage featuring a giant Eggman head and a rather difficult layout. layout. Apparently, an 8th time stone was intended to be collectible here, and after you did, every item box in every level would be replaced with an S monitor, which goes unused in the final and would grant you invincibility and a speed boost. There are also some sprites for Sonic here that never go used, suggesting some cut mechanics, like being pulled up by something and leaping and landing. Finally, for Sonic CD, let's take a look at some concept art. This is concept art for Little Planet, dated from March 12, 1992. It is especially notable because it features an outline of the deleted Round 2 level, which from this art looks like it would have been similar to Marble Zone to some degree, featuring swinging platforms, underground sections, and spike traps. You can also make that assumption from the fact that every level in Sonic CD mirrors the ones from Sonic 1. Palm Tree Panic is Green Hill, Collision Chaos is Spring Yard, Tidal Tempest is Labyrinth, Stardust Speedway Starlight, and Metallic Madness is Scrap Brain. The only level missing would be Marble Zone, which coincidentally is also the second level in Sonic 1. Quartz Quadrant also doesn't really fit any, but it is what it is. Each level also has the time of day it would take place at, as well as the percentage of influence Eggman has over the specified area, both matching up with what is seen in the final more or less. Here you can see a plan for Round 2, where Amy was meant to appear and would fall into a pit and be kidnapped, which only happens in Collision Chaos without the falling part. Now let's actually take a look at Round 2. The level was originally called Dubious Depths, as seen in the Little Planet concept art, as well as being officially confirmed by Naoto Oshima himself. Masato Nishimura also confirmed this, but too revealed another early name for the stage, Ridicule Route. Remnants of how the stage was meant to look like can be found in the developer's diary of the 2011 version, where you can see some sketches of rainbow waterfalls, as well as leftover sprites for the boss and some enemies. Descent Lion is especially interesting since, in the ending cutscene of the game, Sonic goes through an area that looks nothing like anything seen in the final game and is attacked by an antlion. Considering how the stage looks in this scene and how it was meant to be in the Little Planet concept, it can be inferred that they are the same location. This was also confirmed by Masato Nishimura. Sadly, the stage itself isn't really present in any prototype and there are no mock-ups of it. There were a few reasons given for why it was cut. Jim Treadaway, who developed the 1996 PC port, gave an interview in the year 2000 saying that, from a discussion he had with Junetsu Kakuta, who worked on the Sega CD version, the stage was removed due to quality concerns. In a 2011 tweet, Masato Nishimura said that it was cut due to time and memory constraints. In 2022, he would elaborate, saying that the music data for the level didn't fit on the CD-ROM, which, along with a tight development schedule, ultimately resulted in its removal. And in 2023, Naoto Oshima suggested the removal of the stage was due to the level not matching Sonic's speed. Interestingly, in this 2011 tweet, we have other information. We know that Dubious Depths disrupted the intended game structure of shifting between speed-oriented in odd-numbered stages and platforming ones in even-numbered stages. Also, the present track for the level is apparently used for the DA Garden, under the name of Little Planet. Sonic CD's special stages were meant to be a lot like Sonic 1's, except there would be 2 layers from where you'd switch between. According to Hiroaki Chino, the developers thought the special stage was too slow and eventually remade it to fit the Sega CD's capacities better. A later, though still very early screenshot of it shows some yellow objects that look like balloons, apparently meant to be in the place of the UFOs. Either that or they're simply background elements and there were no UFOs yet. It also uses an unknown background. Other things mainly include magazine screenshots specifically for Collision Chaos. These are newer than the VO.02 prototype, yet predate the 510 builds. In an early version of Act 2's Bad Future, you can see that the level would use a different palette. The mountains, clouds, neon signs and terrain look blue, and the background pipes are red. The background itself is also very different, being mostly grey instead of red. And an early version of Act 1's past shows a different object layout. And that's about it for Sonic CD. Now let's quickly take a look at Sonic 3D Blast, since it doesn't have much. While the game does have a handful of prototypes, none of them are that interesting. What is interesting though is the very early build of the game found by John Burton, one of the game's developers who owns the Game Hut YouTube channel. The game itself is very different. It had the split screen functionality, the sprites are more detailed, Sonic controls differently and, of course, a lot of stuff is missing. The level in which this takes place is a very early version of what would eventually become Green Grove, being almost entirely different compared to the final. It doesn't really have anything more to mention, but it's still very interesting to see stuff like this. So, now let's actually take a look at a game that does feature a bunch of stuff. Sonic Adventure. I want to specifically thank Peeps Highway for all the documentation and footage work they've done, so definitely make sure to check them out. Once again, we'll start by the prototype, specifically the AutoDemo. The Sonic Adventure AutoDemo is a build of the game that was designed to showcase the game through automatic demos, hence its name. It was built on the 16th of October 1998, 2 months before the Japanese final release, being released by Orange Fox on the 21st of May 2013. If you've watched my SA1 development video or are familiar with this prototype at all, you're aware of the sheer number of early stuff that's still left over here. It's quite literally a goldmine, with so much stuff to cover and more that was discovered since I posted that video. The build itself is very different compared to the final game, but I won't really mention those that aren't level related. Since some stages really only have object layout differences, I'll just cover the most interesting ones. Meaning the first one is, of course, Windy Valley. For the longest time you couldn't even load into it due to how broken it is normally. Firstly, Act 1 has 1813 objects, while the game is designed to only handle 1023, meaning that increasing the object limit was needed. Then there are two other problems. The first one is that Act 2 loads a null pointer as a texture for whatever reason, resulting in the game accessing invalid memory and thus crashing. Of course, it had to be removed. And then there's an object for this level called PU Wind, which is also used in the final, being that wind that carries Sonic up. That's placed 9 times before the tornado in Act 1, resulting in a crash due to the game being overloaded with the leaf particle effect. The stage itself also had basically no textures. Everything you're seeing was recreated by the modders It's Easy Actually and Super Cool Sonic, who are the authors of the 2018 restoration mod of the level, so definitely check it out. It's noticeable right from the get-go that Act 1 is really laggy due to the ridiculous amount of decorations present, as well as the leaves. Act 2 doesn't really work at all normally. It has no collision, or it's just completely broken rather, and all the springs generate at the default height of 0, so it had to be adjusted. And then Act 3 is even more incomplete. It has multiple areas devoid of anything, and the wind paths don't work very well. As you can imagine, basically everything you see here is completely missing or unused in the final game. It's literally not the same level. Another interesting one is Twinkle Park. This was also a stage that didn't load normally until it was fixed to do so. The stage didn't load since its pointers, basically the memory information where everything is stored, which is read by the game, were for an older version of the file. Since it had approximately 130 broken ones, they all had to be fixed, along with making the textures load, which they didn't normally but were on the disk. Why it's very interesting mostly stems from what can be seen in early screenshots, as well as the initial unveiling of the game at the Tokyo International Forum, which we'll be taking a look at in a bit. There, you can see some unknown areas of Twinkle Park that are clearly not in the final game. As for what is present in the auto demo, besides the level having no lighting, it's just a very clunky and unfinished version of the stage. It has basically no custom cameras and is missing many objects. Act 1 received a redesign, though not anything that interesting, and the swinging pirate ship in Act 2 has an entirely different model, running on different code from the final as well. You can even go through Act 3 too. Also, leftovers of the original Act 1 are present, which most likely pertain to that unknown version of the stage seen at the TIF unveiling, also confirming that this act was nothing like the final one with the cart course. This layout has a build date of September 9th, 1998, which means it was further developed before being scrapped. Any unique objects used by this have been completely removed, and keeping the references to them in the file results in a crash. As for Speed Highway, the notable thing to mention is Act 3. Acts 1 and 2 are largely identical to the final, but are obviously missing some stuff, not even counting the fact that the stage ends in Act 2 at this point. Even if Act 3 is pretty small, along with Windy Valley, it's one of the levels that saw the most changes. The level is textured very differently, mainly using brick textures for everything compared to the concrete of the final. There are more decorations all throughout. One of the most infamous pieces of early development material for this game is this Knuckles screenshot, where you can see a hole in the road with a clock tower, benches and rings inside. Of course, this is not present in the final, but can be seen here in all its glory, even if the textures for the benches are different. A lot of the level design is different in itself. The path leading to the main street is wider and has more spinners. The level goes downhill instead of uphill, the draw distance is much smaller, and the cars look very different. All of this not counting the minor layout and design differences of the objects. Yeah, a lot of the objects were redesigned, ranging from very small tweaks to entirely different looks. The stage also features a long platform, which is really cool in a weird way. The skybox also looks different. In the early screenshots, it didn't have any buildings, which were added in the auto AutoDemo. However, the buildings in this early build are darker and have some different rooftops. Knuckles' level fails to load its object layout correctly because it's outdated, meaning the stage might be unbeatable sometimes as the third chart can generate inside a non-existent object. Also, the unused trash can object from the final can be seen here, although with a different design. Considering how Red Mountain is one of the most complete levels in the game at this point, both for Sonic, Knuckles and Gamma, it's expectable that it doesn't really have many interesting differences. And you'd be right, it really doesn't. However, an unused texture of a ghost can be found in the files for Red Mountain. At this point in development, all of the coding related to the object it pertains to has been removed. However, the models, textures and animations are still here. It was most likely intended for Act 2, but how they would have worked is unknown. Ice Cap also really only features layout differences, but there are still a few things to cover. The level generally has a more wooden appearance, and the small ice decorations around the level are smaller. However, these wood textures are not meant to be there. This happens because of conflicts within the texture's global index, as the stage is actually meant to look how it does in the final. There's a bridge in Act 1 here, which was removed in the final. Act 3 would have featured a ton of dead trees in the path, which were removed. And for some reason, Sonic has his own object layout for Act 4, being Big's level. Loading into it also loads a ton of incorrect objects, a bunch of windmills namely. Casinopolis, is a bit self-explanatory. Development for it has barely been started, and the models here are extremely rough concepts of the level layout. The stage also uses Lost World Skybox texture, for whatever reason. Most functionality is present in the Sonic pinball table, which has its core objects albeit in a very bare-bones state. The most notable feature of Act 1's early model is the Bunny Girl, that would also become the Cowgirl in the Japanese release. The Bunny Girl is also a 3D model unlike the Cowgirl, who appears on a billboard. There would also be a model of a bar nearby which doesn't exist in the final. Act 2 seems to be mostly identical to the final layout-wise, although there is a very long path here that is used which isn't in the final game. And Act 4, the Knight's Pinball Table, is finally something very interesting. The early model present here is nothing like the final game, consisting in a long curved shape. This model seems to be an early version of the fabled scrapped pinball table seen in early images of the game. Sadly, it's not quite that version, but it's still very cool to see. Final Egg is much like Emerald Coast, somewhat resemblant of the final, though has a different object layout and is just a bit incomplete still. The most interesting differences here are Act 2 looking completely different, with the walls having a yellowish theme, much like Act 1, instead of the blue tint in the final. The walls and open areas in the running sections are very different, which is pretty weird, but also cool to see. The small cylindrical tunnel you run through in Act 3 is covered up, but you can still enter it. Here, besides the missing checkpoint, dash panel and rings, its design is very different. In this act, there's also the infamous duck/chick enemy. It has no texture and doesn't really do anything besides shoot other ducks at you, but it's so fucking weird that it's probably my favorite piece of early content from any Sonic game. As for Adventure Fields, only Station Square has any real differences besides object layouts. The Twinkle Park entrance looks completely different, being a castle here instead of the futuristic look of the kart track. Of course, it lines up a lot better with the actual stage theme. The hotel has a hotel sign at the entrance. The inside also has a ladder and chandelier, which were removed from the final, and some buildings are taller. Besides that, only minor differences, like the dock that leads you back to the egg carrier, which is missing. The Chow Gardens also have some differences. While Station Squares is the same one from pre-release images, which isn't that different from the final one, egg carriers and Mystic Ruinses are very different. The former is a piece of geometry ripped straight out of the early Windy Valley Act 3, which can also be seen in very early pre-release screenshots, while the latter has a model similar to Casinopolis. It's just completely different at this point. Sky Chase is one of the most completed areas of the game at this point, weirdly. However, the infamous Unused Dragon object is present here, although it just kind of follows you around. This dragon could be seen in multiple pre-release screenshots. There is also no camera work done, so even if it is a bit more complete than other things we've seen, there was still a lot of progress to be made. Sandhill would also have pyramids and other structures integrated into the layout, which does look undeniably cool. There are also some leftover test levels here. These were removed from the final and replaced with the Hedgehog Hammer minigame, having no lighting or textures and are mostly for testing physics and gameplay. However, only the third test stage can be loaded, being used to test automated paths. We do have geometry for the other two, but they can't be loaded. Now let's actually take a look at leftover final game stuff. It's known that this game features, like with no exaggeration at all, 500 unused objects, and I may even be lowballing it a bit. There's so much stuff to cover that, of course, I won't, because that's not really the point. You can watch my longer cut content video for that. However, on the same note, there are some unused object layouts here from very early versions of the game, meaning they reference objects whose IDs are either different or don't exist anymore, causing them to load incorrectly. These are normally for stages that specific characters never go through, which is weird considering that when you enter a stage with a character that's never supposed to go through there, they use Sonic's object layouts. Sonic has object layout files for Emerald Coast and Twinkle Park Act 3, both for Big's area, Hot Shelter where he never goes through, and Zero's boss fight for whatever reason. He also has files for stages that don't even exist, namely Final Egg Act 4 and Hot Shelter Act 4. Tails uses a unique object layout file for his cutscene with Sonic in Emerald Coast, which is identical to Sonic's Emerald Coast except without the animal capsule. Yes, the entire stage layout is loaded for this. He also has them for all acts of Skydeck, even if he never goes through 2 and 3, being just a small number of wrongly loaded obstacles. Amy has a layout for the Angel Island area of Mystic Ruins, which never goes used since she can never go there. It looks identical to the one used for other characters for the most part. And there is another leftover file that isn't used for any stages, with its only object being a ring at the -999 coordinates for all axes. Still on unused objects, and I really do have to cover this one, the unused plugs for Hot Shelter. This level was originally going to have several plug-related mechanics, as evidenced by these models. There are a few leftover sound effects, as well as voice lines for Tikal that explain how these would work.
If you're hanging from a cord, use the directional pad to sway. By touching the cord next to you, you will be able to switch cords. To pull out a plug, hold it and shake it.
In fact, there are a ton of unused Tikal lines that explain some cut game features. She has a line saying,
"You can pick up and throw the small chicks."
While it's unknown what she means by chicks, it can be inferred that she's referring to the small ducks shot by the duck enemy in Final Egg. Chaos 6's fight has a few unused concepts for it. Specifically, the arena would still have the egg carrier cannons around, which you could use to escape.
Use the cannon to move around and avoid attacks.
Similarly, there are a couple of unused mechanics for Perfect Chaos also suggested by these clips. Namely, the water could be contaminated somehow.
The water has been contaminated.
You'd be able to drown, possibly if you ran out of rings as Supersonic.
Get onto something before you drown.
And the boss would have a barrier, which would only be depleted by destroying its tentacles.
Destroy the tentacles. Without them, the barrier won't recover. Attack the tentacles twice to destroy it. The tentacle turns red when you hit it. If you can hit it again, you can destroy the tentacle.
Lastly, for voice clips, the announcer heard in some areas of the game has some unused lines. The ones most interesting are unknown where they could be used, but it would probably be for Skydeck. There are specific voice clips for a strong wind warning.
Warning, strong winds approaching. Strong wind alert cancelled.
And one of a tidal wave, with nothing like that happening in the final game.
Warning, tidal wave approaching. Be careful when the ship tilts.
Finally, for Sonic Adventure, let's take a look at pre-release material and concept art. On August 22, 1998, Sonic Adventure was unveiled at the Tokyo International Forum in Japan to media and fans alike. At this point, the game is still heavily incomplete, with a lot of stages appearing very different compared to their final incarnations. Of course, I won't really talk about the different object layouts. Emerald Coast is missing basically every decorative object at the beginning except for the trees. Windy Valley was, as mentioned before, completely overhauled for the final. The version here is more colorful and open, while the finals is more realistic and much more linear. How it appears here seems to be very similar to the AutoDemo. From what is covered here, it seems that the stage would have been played by Sonic, Amy, Gamma, Big and Tails, with the latter also being shown in promotional material for Sonic Adventure DX weirdly. Twinkle Park's Act 1 was, once again, completely different at this point in development. Tails can also be seen here in an unknown area, most likely pertaining to the early Act 1. Speed Highway was probably the most featured stage here, and as such many differences can be seen, such as different lighting, more basic decoration, and the level being generally very incomplete. As covered previously, Act 3 saw a lot of changes made for the final. Here you can see many placeholder textures, and the geometry fades in much closer to the character than in the final. Red Mountain was also another stage that was featured a lot. In Act 1, the stage is generally simpler in terms of effects and decorations, and the skybox used is different. However, the effects for Act 2 are far more complex. The skulls had the glow effect, and the lighting in general was better, even having dynamic shadows. All of these were most likely cut for performance reasons. Lost World mainly features better dynamic lighting in Act 3, which looks really good. Ice Cap had a lot of dead trees, the same ones found in the AutoDemo. Final Egg has a pretty different object arrangement at the start, and Gamma Stages had multiple Sonic dolls, which was changed. Station Square City Hall looks pretty different. It has a taller design and a stylized gate, which aren't in the final, and the chairs and tables at the pool are still missing at this point. Mystic Ruins' jungle features two paths that don't exist in the final, yet are present in the AutoDemo. There, the trees were also modeled and the sandhill area was different. And lastly, for the egg carrier, the prison has a much more yellow palette, the transformation sequence shows a lighting effect that isn't in the final game, and you can see the Windy Valley Chow Garden for a few moments, which is really cool. As for pre-release screenshots, despite Windy Valley being different and pushing the boundaries of functional, there are quite a few screenshots of it that give you some insight into what the stage was officially looking like. Some of these images are even used in the final game, like when Amy thinks of Sonic rescuing her. There are also screenshots of the stage post-redesign, mainly showing a completely different area here from what is seen in the final, to the point that I don't really know where this is besides knowing it's in Act 1, and Sonic bouncing in a trampoline somewhere that was removed in the final. Casinopolis features that Knight's pinball table I've shown, Sonic standing in an early version of the shower room, slot machines and large emerald line signs removed from the final game, spike balls at the beginning of Act 2 as well as what appears to be a different water effect, and a pool of water rather than the light at the end of Act 2. Ice Cap's cave had a very different green lighting ambience, and the jump panel sequences originally ended in a star panel, much like the AutoDemo. The snowboarding segment would have also featured a timer that would increase by performing different tricks. Twinkle Park also features that early Act 1, and a completely unknown area where Amy stands in some pink light surrounded by yellow walls. And weirdly the same goes for Big. He's also standing in a completely unknown area here, theorized to be for Twinkle Park considering the overall aesthetic. Similarly to Windy Valley, there are also a bunch of screenshots of the early Speed Highway Act 3, showcasing the differently colored cars and the early building textures. Red Mountain shows a red bridge, the different inside lighting, and a clear view of the early skybox texture. These also show a removed uppercut move for Knuckles. Sky Chase shows that Sonic and Tails would have originally used their Sonic Gem models, and the dragon is very much present here. Lost World shows different lighting and a somewhat different skybox texture for the outdoor segment. Station Square, appearance-wise, appears to be very close to what is seen in the final. However, oddities include a very empty pool area, NPCs standing in line at a newsstand, which was sadly removed, and the different sky textures it used. As for the egg carrier, an early version of a cutscene for Gamma shows that all the 100 robots would just be copies of him. Well, they're most likely just placeholders, but still. The area also had glowing doors, probably to represent a barrier impeding passage. A Mystic Ruin screenshot shows that, in the cutscene where the entrance to the Angel Island appears, Sonic would run from the rocks falling, while in the final he's off screen. And finally, concept art. An early concept for the Emerald Altar shows that it would have been located underground, in what's likely supposed to be Lost Worlds. Speaking of Lost Worlds, it has some development images of how the concept is transformed into a model, showing the wireframe, then just a model with no textures and basic lighting, and then the finalized version, which is cool to see. Alternate designs for the egg carrier exist, mainly depicting as a sort of train and another one as a submarine. Interior art for it shows it looking darker and more mysterious than in the final. It also looks like a long corridor as opposed to the giant room of the final game. Here's a concept for the monorail where Eggman's face seems to have Viking-like horns, and the final concept for the egg carrier depicts it with a much more yellow color scheme as well as a ton of lightning. Emerald Coast would appear to look more wooden than in the final, with the loops and paths appearing to be paved, which isn't the case most times. Here is an early concept for the early Windy Valley, as evidenced by the floating platforms with helixes and the arrows. The paths, however, look like the finals. Concept art of Mystic Ruins' jungle showing Sonic holding a torch, and another one showing Sonic on top of the temple, which is much taller at the top. And lastly, here's a concept for Big's house, which does resemble what is seen in the final, with the same going for Tails' lab. And that's it for Sonic Adventure. Now let's cover Sonic Adventure 2, which sadly doesn't have nearly as many stuff, not even close. As such, we'll take a look at what's in the final game first, and then early promotional material and concept art, as even if SA2 has a bunch of prototypes, none of them really suggest any big differences or cut levels. When the game was being developed, there were at least 3 test levels, of which some things are left over in the final game, mainly textures for how they would look, which are mostly from City Escape or early versions of it at least. These are Basic Test, Knuckles Test and Sonic Test, however you can't load into any of them in the Dreamcast version since the game simply crashes. Even so, Basic Test was left over in SA2 Battle, and the object layout for Knuckles Test is also left over, seeming to follow the same basic blueprint as Basic, which in turn means that the only one completely lost to time is Sonic Test, having no remnants in the final or any early builds besides the textures. These are very simple, there are slopes, stairs, rails, what you would expect. Knuckles Test is the most incomplete, as it only has a single camera angle focusing a non-existent object in the center of the map. You can also grab the first 2 emeralds, which randomly spawn, and the last one seems to always be in the same spot, but you can never get it. However, there is something related to Sonic Test in some early material for the game, which we'll be taking a look at in a bit. If you fly off the start of White Jungle, you can see a bunch of objects floating in midair, seemingly randomly placed here although following a set path. While this just seems weird, if you load White Jungle's layout into Green Forest, you'll see that it's actually a remnant of an early version of the stage. At this point, the level was still very incomplete, but the entire stage does have objects, suggesting it may even be older than the version shown at E3 2000, which we'll also take a look at in a moment. Similarly, the Dreamcast version has an unused multiplayer layout for City Escape. However, this stage isn't playable for 2-player modes and wouldn't be until Battle. It's also completely different from the single-player layout or the multiplayer one seen in Battle, and it seems to line up much better with the one seen in the SA2 Dutch Trial prototype, one of the oldest builds of the game we have access to currently. So, let's take a look at early material. Sonic Adventure 2 was first announced at E3 2000, having many differences from the final. At this point, only City Escape, Green Forest, Sky Rail, Pumpkin Hill and Iron Gate are shown, although the latter two don't have any really noticeable differences. Additionally, screenshots for Aquatic Mine and the Chow Garden were released. City Escape is shown to just be a long path with a truck chase sequence, and even then the section is nothing like the final. The skybox is very simple, being just a blue gradient, and some of the textures used here are actually from the Sonic Test level. So yeah, this was the related thing I just mentioned, as apparently this was a test level for the truck segments. The screenshots released let you see this at a higher resolution, showing that the level is clearly nothing more than this. Green Forest, for the little that is shown, appears to resemble what can be seen in the final more than City Escape does. However, even if it's very hard to tell and to compare in general, some parts do feel different. These robots aren't here in the final, and a lot of complex camera work is shown, though it's most likely just for trailer purposes. Screenshots for the level sort of corroborate this. The level both feels the same and different, as some areas appear to be unknown, and Sky Rail is weird in the sense that Sonic is here, while in the final only Shadow is. The level in general is just incomplete. Some parts aren't animated yet, and there seems to be no fog at this point. Well, there is also Aquatic Mine, which features a different underwater effect and lighting. And the Chow Garden, of course. The model appears to be identical, however the water is colored differently between some screenshots. For 10 days, starting on the 22nd of September 2000, 2 screenshots a day were released on Sonic Team's website, amounting to 20 in total. E3 was in May of that year, mind you, so you can actually see some progress. All levels appear to be much more like the final, as is to be expected, although there aren't any that interesting really. Well, there are some, like this unknown area of Metal Harbor, though it's probably just by a random piece of decoration around the rocket area. Now it's concept art time. Concept art for City Escape looks a lot more like Radical Highway. It would have a section where you grind along the Golden Gate Bridge, which only happens in Shadow's level, and the terrain seems a lot flatter than the final, which is a lot more vertical in nature. You would also be able to grind along walls and half-pipes. Pumpkin Hill has this drawing of the train, which in itself has a bit of a different design and doesn't seem like it would be able to go anywhere much. Aquatic Mine looks very different compared to what we got in the final. There seem to be some houses or castle in a small platform, and a small water pond below, all apparently taking place in a hole. However, the weird part about this is the scale, as I at least can't understand if this is meant to be massive or not that big. Knuckles seems pretty big here, but he's also close to the viewer, so I think that suggests that the scale for the level was meant to be much larger. Iron Gate has this cool, very detailed elevator. Nothing much to say really. Well, there is something to say kinda. Another concept for it shows that the level could have been multi-layered, with narrow hallways where enemies would surround you from above. And lastly, here's some artwork for Weapons Bed's location, which seems like it would take place in much larger ships. And that's about it for Sonic Adventure 2. Now let's take a look at another very interesting game, Sonic Heroes. There is a bunch of stuff, so I'll start by the prototypes with the E3 2003 build. It was displayed, of course, at E3 2003 to fans and press alike, almost 8 months before the final game's release. It was dumped in 2016 in a joint effort between Sonic Retro and the Spanish fan site Sonic Paradise. While Seaside Hill is the only stage normally accessible, and it has a ton of differences, although mostly just regarding its object layout, there are a ton of other stages present here that can be accessed through other means. Firstly, we have Ocean Palace. The stage is overall very empty at this point, only having a few enemies at the start and being impossible to complete normally due to the lack of objects. Even so, the level layout is largely identical to the final. The most interesting difference is that the turtles didn't have feet at this point, as well as the area that sends you to the rock chase being made up of 2 springs instead of the platform stairs and then a single spring. Even with all of that, it still is very much functional. But then there are levels like Bullet Station. Just take a look at this. It is, for the lack of a better way to put it, extremely rough. The layout itself seems identical to the final, but it uses placeholder textures and lacks objects and most collision data. With Team Sonic, you're spawned inside the tunnel section, which is far away from any level geometry, but the other teams spawn in another location, making it far easier to check the stage out. The skybox textures are also completely different from those found in the final. It seems that the canon concept hadn't been implemented yet. And those were the levels that could load normally. Now it's time for the ones that crash right upon startup, starting with the fabled Grand Metropolis. This level has a lot of data inside the disk, level geometry, collision and textures, however you can't access it due to some outdated files that result in a crash. The level had to be ported into the 10.8 prototype for it to load, which in itself doesn't have that many noteworthy differences. If you play the level normally, you'll see that it actually isn't that different from the final. There are some missing energy roads and some other extra ones, which is weird, but nothing much. That is, until you get here. From this point on, the level is completely different from the final, including never seen geometry and much earlier textures. Like, it's impossible to make a direct comparison because the level is just entirely different here. The grind rail part along the buildings is identical though, and the part where you use the pole is also the same, although heavily unfinished. Even so, the level from that point on is also completely different until the final part. What I didn't mention is that the level didn't have any object layout in the E3 build. Then you might be wondering where the layout you're seeing comes from. Well, from the final game, of course. If you've ever played this level in 2-player mode, you know that it ends before that bridge you have to lower in the normal stage. However, what you might not know is that beyond it lies a very early layout for the stage, one that lines up with the E3 build's geometry. Considering how this is the situation for a couple of stages, it can be deduced that most of the 2-player layouts are actually early versions of the normal levels. The E3 stage does technically have an object layout, but it's just a single spring. Power Plant is the same situation as Grand Metropolis. It simply crashes due to outdated files needing to be ported into the 10.8 build. Much like that stage as well, stage collision, geometry and texture data was retained from the E3 demo. However, this stage isn't nearly as different. The object layout used for this is the final one, as no build features an early one that doesn't match the stage layout. The stage itself appears final, but there are some different textures as well as unfinished ones, and other places simply use placeholders. Casino Park doesn't really have anything. It has a camera layout and that's literally it. If you overlay it over the final geometry, it seems that some pinball tables were slightly larger and the paths were positioned differently. These cameras would later be included in other prototypes named as Izuka Back. It probably has to do with something Takashi Iizuka did for the level, like literally all of them, but what it means is anyone's guess. In contrast, Bingo Highway does have some things, and I'm stretching that definition a bit, saying that anything works would be a hyperbole, because there's literally only collision data and stage geometry. Nothing else works. The stage is completely made up of placeholder textures and simple vertex colors. Besides that, there isn't much to say really. The layout appears to be mostly the same as the final, but of course it's very incomplete. There's also an object layout for this consisting of a whopping 3 springs. Frog Forest is mostly complete at this point. The only real differences are that the stage features much more vegetation and the leaves look slightly different. Some models are also early, so they break in the 10.8 conversion. one. And look at this. Do you remember the frogs looking like this? Yeah, this is how they originally looked. Pretty scary, huh? Lost Jungle is slightly different compared to the final. The collision doesn't really match one-to-one, but is pretty close, and the alligator is very high poly for whatever reason, which thanks the game's performance. And lastly, for Egg Fleet, it's kind of the same situation as it was for Bullet Station. The full draft for the level is here, however the stage crashes at a specific point. Namely, there are a ton of placeholders for cannons and fans, which are part of the level geometry itself instead of objects. There are also missing rails or different rail paths in some areas. This prototype also features some interesting unused objects. Firstly, a swinging bar. Of course, this was introduced in SA2 but is missing in Heroes. How it would have worked is probably the same as it was in the previous game. Here is a seesaw object, as well as weights that would have gone with it. Once again, how it works seems pretty self-explanatory, however where and when is anyone's guess. There's this gate with a smiling bomb in the center. While it's unknown what this could be or what it would be used for, there are unused audios in the final game referencing a gate that Omo Chow could interact with.
Looks like that Omo Chow has something to do with this gate.
There's an Omo Chow symbol on this gate. Maybe we should ask that Omo Chow.
Looks like that Omo Chow has something to do with this gate.
While not really related to the E3 demo, but still on the same notes, let's quickly take a look at some unused audios from the final game, since they're the only things I want to cover from there. There are 2 voice clips for Charmy entering and leaving some kind of area in Rail Canyon meant just for him, but of course that never happens in game.
If they can't come over here, then I guess I'm on my own. Wonder if that switch did anything. Maybe I should check.
There are multiple lines for teams talking about areas where they never go through in the final game, most of them for Team Rose, namely the VIP room in Casino Park.
So this is the VIP room, huh? There's supposed to be a really gorgeous room past these stairs.
The giant mushrooms in Frog Forest.
I've never seen a mushroom that big. You're right. It's more like a giant tree than a mushroom.
The speed trial in Mystic Mansion.
Use homing attack on the ghosts to get to the other side.
The first bullet dodging section in Egg Fleet.
They're shooting at us. Dodge the bullets by moving up and down. Move up!
They're shooting again. Must dodge the bullets. Up and down.
Move down!
The Team Blast hint for the 3 egg hammers before the final self-destruction switch.
It's time for Team Blast!
The lava room in Team Chaotix's chemical plant.
Whoa! Looks like that lava is rising.
Watch out, everybody.
Must be an energy storage tank. Better get out before it gets full.
And some lines hint that there used to be an attack that made Metal Sonic invisible.
He's gone!
Watch out, everybody!
Where'd he go?
Even when he's invisible, he'll briefly appear when he attacks. Pay close attention so you can locate his position.
Now let's take a look at the 9.28 PS2 prototype, probably the last one I'm gonna be covering for this game. This is the earliest known full prototype and is only available for the PS2 version. It was released by Hidden Palace on the 1st of January 2024, being built on the 2nd of October 2003, yet its files are dated from the 28th of September, hence the name. Of course, it predates the 10.8 prototype from the 8th of October, even if this one does seem a bit more finalized at times than that one, for whatever reason. This prototype features a considerable number of differences, but as always only the most interesting will be covered. Seagate has many untextured objects. Team Chaotix has an unmodified Team Sonic layout in Seaside Hill. Actually, it seems that most of the alternate teams use Team Sonic's object layouts early in development. The falling stone pillars don't work in Ocean Palace. Their collision does move accordingly, but the visuals do not. Grand Metropolis is very interesting. Firstly, Team Dark uses what seems to be an early layout for Team Sonic, and in general all the other non-Team Sonic teams have remnants of the E3 layout, which is corroborated by comparing that one to this one, as well as many objects not fitting with the level geometry at all. However, Team Chaotix does feature a unique layout, one that seems even earlier than Team Dark and Rose. Team Rose's power plant is very bare bones and features basically no object layout at this point. As for Casino Park, a lot of textures are transparent, which makes them look odd in some situations. Others are merely untextured, most likely using an incorrect blending mode. Bingo Highway has this weird and properly textured floor, which does look kinda cool. Some of the pinball parts also have culling issues, causing them to not render at all. The leaves in Frog Forest use a very early design with a brown center instead of being completely green. The frogs also don't render correctly. However, the 2-player version of the stage has the final frog design, except its eyes are green instead of black. The rain also looks purple. Lost Jungle has broken swamp and water geometry blending, and another early version of the frog. Some growing vines also have severe rendering issues, either rendering rendering in an incorrect position or having vertex explosions. As for Hang Castle, the final pull that sends the player into the Metal Sonic/Eggman statue is broken in Team Dark stage, sending you too low. This possibly indicates that the geometry was changed at some point. Much like Casino Park, Mystic Mansion has some parts with unexpected transparency due to incorrect texture masking. Similarly, the Thunder Lights use a different blending mode, so you can easily see the texture design. Egg Emperor plays pretty differently, being much harder due to being so fast and invisible in some specific situations. And Metal Overlord is part untextured, part black, part textured. Now let's take a look at some concept art. Here is some artwork for the ending area of Ocean Palace. The main difference here is the rocks with the waterfalls in the background, and it being marked as a seaside hill concept. Also, this image is used as the background for the early E3 title screen, weirdly. There are also some mockups of areas that don't exist in the final game. And weirdly, this concept of the Whale Island from Seaside Hill is marked as being from Ocean Palace. It seems that the way you'd get into it would be different, as you'd enter it from the mouth and then be shot out from above. Concept art for Casino Park shows how different it would have looked like. Firstly, it seems that the paths were narrower, green as opposed to red, and the level would have featured many more decorations both around the paths and in them. There's also some sort of domino barrier in the middle of the path. To be honest, it looks a lot more like the racing game iterations of the stage. And here is Rail Canyon. It does look somewhat like the final motif, yet the trains look different, there's a lot more machinery around, and the rail tracks are supported by mechanical cacti, while in the final they're just kind of floating in midair. Similarly, Bullet Station seems more mechanical, where you can see factories in the distance, as well as a ton of rail tracks, and the trains themselves look different, having Eggman's face and a giant revolver on top. It also seems like the level would have had a much closer floor than it does in the final, where it's just an abyss below. Concept art for Frog Forest shows that it would have actually been a prehistoric themed stage, as you can see dinosaurs in the distance and what seems like more exotic vegetation. The ground would have also had a checkered pattern like Green Hill. As for Lost Jungle, the stage would have apparently been massive. You can tell this by the size of the path, which is really small compared to the mushrooms and plants, as well as the pond itself. However, the pond is very clearly a photo with some sort of scribble filter applied to it, with everything else being drawn on top. The alligator section also has some artwork, namely showing the three Team Sonic characters lining up side by side in the vines, instead of being in fly formation. Artwork for Hang Castle shows some different looking paths, as well as arches in the middle of them. Interestingly, there's a structure shaped like a cat in a distance. Concept art for Egg Fleet looks a lot more like Final Fortress, with thunder and a ton of clouds surrounding the level. Of course, Egg Fleet doesn't really look like this, but Final Fortress does. Speaking of Final Fortress, artwork of it actually shows that it would have taken place underwater. There seems to be some sort of aquarium in the top portion of the image, with Team Sonic traveling through a path just below it. You would have probably taken Eggman's ships down in Egg Fleet, then go through their inside in Final Fortress after they landed back on the ground. Interestingly, there's also artwork for two scrapped levels. One is a pirate-themed level, and the other some sort of ancient ruins. The latter even has the guy who reflects physical. And lastly for Heroes, we have to take a look at the Sonic Heroes recording script. It contains descriptions of what's going on in each scene, the dialogue for the characters, and the length of each line. This is all in Japanese, so the translation was made by Windy and posted on our website, so definitely check it out. This features very interesting things. While the dialogue itself is mostly the same as the final, the settings in which they take place are different for the most part, specifically the bosses. Robot Carnival in Bingo Highway was actually Egg Hermit Crab. By the name you can imagine that it was a robot with the shape of a hermit crab. Then instead of Robot Storm, there was Egg Sea Anemone, once again a sea anemone shaped mech. The Egg Emperor was also called Egg Mobile Force, however its appearance isn't described. And now time for the most interesting thing here. I'm sure you remember that, after Lost Jungle, you fight with Team Dark, yes? Well, imagine that, instead of that fight, you had a random boss, which isn't specified in the script, and then you went to another level that isn't Hang Castle, and in that level you would then fight Team Dark. Well, that was actually meant to happen, as Team Sonic would go through a Christmas-themed level. The intro cutscene for it has no dialogue. However, the start for Team Dark's encounter cutscene says that they're waiting at the top of the cliff as they pass through the Christmas mountain range, much like what happens at Lost Jungle. It seems that only Team Sonic would go through here, as the entry was removed for the other teams. Either that, or it had already been scrapped at that point and they just hadn't removed it for Team Sonic yet. And that's about it for Sonic Heroes. Now let's take a look at Shadow the Hedgehog. While this one doesn't feature many things related to cut levels, it still features some. There are two very interesting textures for the main menu left over in the files, one for the E3 demo and another for the TGS demo. For the former, it would have early versions of Westopolis, Sky Ruins and Death Troops. While the E3 build for the game has been found, it hasn't been dumped yet and we're still waiting for it. There's also footage of these online, though very short, but they only seem to feature object layout differences for what can be seen. And as for the latter, it would feature another early version of Westopolis, as well as Glyphic Canyon and Cryptic Castle, with an early version of the latter stage being lost to this day. Sadly, the TGS build hasn't been found or dumped yet. Well, the Japanese trial version does feature Cryptic Castle, but it only lets you complete a hero mission normally and the stage is final, except for this spring here. The rest of the stage is actually present, so they literally just cut off the path to the rest of the level. There are unused lines for all characters except Maria that reference an orange light frame. Apparently, it would have launched you in the air, allowing you to perform a pretty big jump. It seems like it sort of worked like the dash rings.
If I speed up and jump through that light frame, I can get some good distance.
Get your speed up and jump within that orange frame, and you'll get some serious air.
And lastly, for the final game, before we take a look at early development material and concept art, are test levels. This game features 9 test stages left over in the files, even if not all of them are present in their entirety. The first one is stage 0000, which is also present in Sonic Heroes, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games, and Knight's Journey of Dreams weirdly. It's a flat surface with areas to test physics, stairs, slopes and other paths. Contrary to Heroes though, this has no layout. Stage 0001 works kind of the same way, though is much more focused on physics and features more slopes. Stage 0002 is simply for material testing. It's composed of a rectangle with different material textures applied to the ground and walls. Stage 0003 was for UV testing, so basically how textures are applied and look on objects. It features the image of some guy saying UV test, and that's about it. Stage 8900 is an early or scrapped ellipse cannon cutscene, but shows nothing in-game. Then there is stage 9900, one of the weirdest pieces of scrapped and early content in any Sonic game to me. It's a pretty large stage, being mostly made up of assets from Sonic Heroes' Egg Fleet, featuring a giant loop, a big circular platform, and some other platforms and buildings. There's also this area with the hexagonal net, which looks like it was taken from Power Plant. It's speculated that it could have been a test level for vehicles, but since no object layout remains, there's no way to confirm this. The stage itself also features unused textures. 2 of them are skybox textures for Rail Canyon and Bullet Station, and the other one looks like a really dystopian city, straight out of the Half-Life 2 beta from the look of it. It's presumed it would have been used for Westopolis very early into the game's development. There's also some collision left over which doesn't match the level geometry at all. This most likely pertains to another test stage that isn't present here at all. And lastly, there is stage 9901, being a prototype version of the Shadow Creation Room, missing some effects, having no collision, and featuring some other missing things like geometry. There is also stage 6000, but it only has one file which is completely empty. And now time for concept art. There's basically nothing, sadly. However, here are some sketches for the gimmicks in the game. Most of them appear to have their final design and functionality, but it's still very interesting to look at nonetheless. And that's about it for Shadow. Now time for Sonic 06, which as you can imagine does feature some things to look at. Let's start by prototypes. Well, DLC prototypes that is. The only prototype we have access to is the XPLA demo, which doesn't have many things besides a different Kingdom Valley object layout. Well, they also don't have many things and haven't been very well explored yet, but they still deserve a mention. The reason why they haven't been very well explored yet is because they were released in February of this year. I'm writing this on the 14th of May and recording it on the 21st, so I don't know how long ago it will be when this releases, but it's very recent. There are 11 of them released by obscure gamers, including early versions of the Very Hard DLC, as well as extremely early ones of the scrapped Super Hard mode, which we'll take a look at in a moment, and Extra and Amigo character DLCs. Some are also identical to their final counterparts. From here on out, I want to thank Fan the Otter, or Otter with a Controller on YouTube, for giving me all the information. You may also know him from my Sonic 06 cut content video where he also helped me me a ton, so definitely make sure to check them out. So all of these, besides the Test 0001 Amigo DLC and the Boss Attack DLC, the latter of which are identical to the final, all of them are early versions of Sonic's, Shadow's and Silver's very hard and extra modes. So the Amigo story tests are what they seem like, early versions of this scrapped concept from the game which ended up being repurposed for the Team Attack Amigo DLCs. Here, each alternate playstyle would have a unique small story, and while this prototype really only has tales and there are only a sequence of missions, all of this goes unused in the final, including the usage of gimmicks that Tails never takes advantage of normally. There's also leftover text for this which shows an introduction to it by Lord Regis. He too makes a reference to Kynaps, which is the middleware program that the game uses for its NPC AI behavior and pathing, which to this day is still unreadable. The menu depicting the character, instead of Tails, shows Mephiles for whatever reason. Of course, he isn't playable sadly. The folders here and act IDs are the same as Team Attack Amigo, further corroborating the belief of this being an early version of that. Even so, everything that is present here seems to suggest that either only Tails would have featured the story like this, or that no other character ever got this far into development. Then we have the other prototypes. I'm not gonna cover all of them because not all are that different or interesting. Just about every stage besides the ones I'll mention are mere early versions of the final's hard modes, which seem to have been their base. The biggest differences there is that the Amigo character transitions usually take place in different areas. Shadow's extra layout is a White Acropolis mission where you have to defeat every single enemy in the stage, which is a bit tedious. And Sonic's early very hard layout actually follows the normal and hard mode paths, while the final version is played backwards. Sadly, that's about the most interesting differences. However, the actual final game does feature a bunch of stuff to take a look at. If you use a glitch, you can access the blocked portion of the castle town at the beginning of the game before Wave Ocean to enter an early version of Soliana Forest. Here, the layout is very clearly a test one, featuring double sets of doors in multiple areas, a multitude of signs, including the no symbol, checkered strips, stop signs, and speed limit posts, with some crazy layering issues to boot. Out of all of these, only the stop signs go unused, which are remnants of the cars planned for the new city. Which brings us to the new city. By also using a glitch, you can access New City before Dusty Desert is unlocked as Shadow. Doing so reveals an early version of this area which has several vehicles driving around. Since their AI is very unfinished, they often drive into buildings and can't really follow the roads. You can also see Crisis City and Flame Core warp gates, stages that are never accessed through those means, and a pigeon NPC called Hatsune, which is normally only present in Silver's story. On the same note, here is an early version of Soliana Castletown, being the one shown on the monitor Silver, Blaze and Mephiles are looking at. 3 Amigo characters, being Rouge in Tropical Jungle, Tails in Wave Ocean and Blaze also in Wave Ocean, have unused hard mode layouts. From what is seen in the final game, only the main Hedgehogs have these, so these are most likely a remnant from a different plan in development. Sonic has an unused layout for Section B of Dusty Desert, which doesn't really align with the level geometry. In the final, only Shadow goes through here, and considering how short Sonic's level is, he would have probably gone through here at some point. Similarly, Silver has an unused layout for Section A, which plays pretty normally for a Silver level, though seems to be simply a slightly modified Sonic layout. While he does go through here in End of the World, that section has a different layout weirdly. Still on Dusty Desert, Sonic has a scrapped layout for Section C. Yes, Section C. If you're familiar enough with the game, you know that this level only has 2 distinct sections, which means that this one was removed from the game. This is like Crisis City Section D, in the sense that it has a layout but no collision or stage model is left over of it. However, unlike that one, Dusty Deserts does load inside Section A's boundaries and even lines up with it at points. This begs the question of, either Section A was initially Section C, and the original Section A was scrapped, meaning this section here also looked pretty different at some point, or this is simply a coincidence, as there are long trails of rings that go inside the mountains and stuff. This is also similar to Section C of White Acropolis, which too doesn't exist. It has nothing left over for it except a Lua file, which is called in Sonic's own functions for the stage. That is all that's known about it though. But now let's actually get into the mentioned Crisis City Section D, one of the most elusive scrapped elements from this game. There is a leftover Sonic layout for this unknown section, which doesn't line up with any of the existing areas in the final game, and any collision or terrain files are since long gone. Multiple early screenshots for the game show what is most likely this section, due to 1. The areas shown are unknown, and 2. Some of what can be seen lines up with the leftover layout. While the game doesn't have many leftovers from its E3 2006 demo, Silver's layout for that build is actually present here. Of course, it's just a different object layout that only goes so far. Also weirdly, there is only a single test level left over in the files. This is a pretty big playground for Shadow for vehicle, spline and enemy testing. The actual level model isn't left over, it was just recreated created from the leftover collision. Sadly, there are also layouts for removed test levels, yet their collision and geometry are no longer on the disc. There are also a bunch of scrapped objects for gimmicks that don't exist in the final game, like rail switches for Radical Train, a jump port object similar to the one from Unleashed, damage billiard ball variations for Silver's Dusty Desert, a wind collision for Kingdom Valley, which is present in the XBLA demo, grind paths for the Castle Town, as well as grind ropes and wires that were intended to be used here as well. There are also a bunch of other objects for these hubs, but most of them are simply decorative or have to do with town missions that were scrapped, and a syncing mechanic for both Flame Core and Dusty Desert. Similarly, there are unused lines that suggest some scrapped mechanics and sections for stages. A tag mode was planned for the game, where Sonic and Shadow would work together against Eggman to collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds. As such, multiple lines for it go unused.
So, I'm stuck working with you. Don't slow me down, Sonic.
It looks like Dr. Eggman is after the Chaos Emeralds again. Shadow, we're in this one together. There are 6 emeralds left. Hurry!
There's probably an emerald here too. Don't fall behind.
There are 4 emeralds left. Let's get moving!
The doctor never learns, does he? Hurry, there are 3 emeralds left.
Eggman's attacks are getting worse. Don't let them do you in. We'll have to work together here.
Nice job, Sonic.
Thanks, Shadow.
I can't believe this. I'll leave it up to you, Sonic.
I can't believe I got caught in a trap. I'm counting on you, Shadow.
About time you showed up.
Hey, you're late.
I'll drive. You take him down, Sonic.
This piece of junk. We'd be better off without it, wouldn't we?
The Chaos Emeralds are mine. I'll defeat you two together. Ha! There are still other emeralds. I'll get them before you. You're just in time. I'll take those emeralds from you now. Sonic, Shadow, the next time we meet, I'll...
Similarly, unused lines for both of the Hedgehogs in Crisis City suggest they would have worked together at some point.
Shadow, don't be late.
You're talking to me? Will I make it?
Shadow!
Sonic, let's hurry.
Hang on, Shadow!
Whoa!
Shadow was swept up into the tornado! I've got to help him!
It looks like Sonic was swept up into the tornado. If I use my glider...
There are also unused animations for Sonic which mimic those that Shadow has for his vehicles. There are lines for a switch mechanic that required 2 characters to push it.
This switch requires 2 to push it.
And Silver having the ability to grind on rails.
It looks like I can jump up and grind there.
Now time for early promotional material. While I didn't really want to talk about it because it doesn't really have much to do with stages, I simply can't avoid it. Of course, the E3 and TGS 2005 showcases of the game depict a very different version from the one we eventually got. Even so, Kingdom Valley here appears to be weirdly close to the final, though there is this bridge here instead of the wind path of the final. The same mostly goes for E3 2006. The biggest difference is Kingdom Valley Skybox, which is a clear blue sky instead of the overcast sky, resulting in different lighting as well. In early trailers for the game, as well as the game preview in the XBLA demo, an early version of the Castle Town is shown. It is much brighter and colorful, having real-time lighting which allows small details to cast shadows, similarly to Sonic Unleashed. It was also much more populated and had a different layout with more height variations, different buildings, different tree textures and a different sky. There were also no cliffs, making the area feel more open. Early screenshots of the game show that unknown Crisis City area I mentioned, as well as an unknown area of tropical jungle. Silver screenshots in the former stage also show a different look for the tornado, which is left over in the final but looks completely broken. And lastly, for concept art, we really only have early artwork for Crisis City. It looks very much like what the final version does, with the only difference being a less red and darker color scheme and a thunder in the sky. And that's about it for Sonic 06. So it's time for Sonic Unleashed, which is the last game to feature a considerable amount of stuff to cover besides Frontiers, since it seems like Sonic Team started to cover their development tracks. For this one, I recommend you checking out The Storm, as he has a ton of very detailed videos covering these differences, which of course I won't cover all. I'll just get it out of the way. There are a ton of unused layouts for almost every single stage. Some are remnants of very early builds, while others are seen in prototypes or are just slightly different versions versions of the final one. As such, and as I've mentioned, I won't be covering all of them, just the most interesting. So let's start by taking a look at the preview build. This prototype is a debug build of the game from approximately the 1st of September 2008. It's split into 2 or 3 discs, however we only have access to the first one, with the other 2 probably being lost forever. It was dumped and released by obscure gamers on the 6th of December 2016. This version contains many early versions of stages, and even has a bunch of them that would later become DLC. However, only Windmill Isle, Savannah Citadel, Cool Edge, Rooftop Run and Dragon Road are present. Once again, I won't be covering all of them, so every stage I don't mention you can assume that the differences are very minor or just subtle. Windmill Isle Act 3 is very bare bones at this point. It only has a single camera which breaks often, and there's no goal ring. Act 4 for this level has no terrain, and has the object layout from Act 3, meaning the stage still hadn't been made at that point. Windmill Isle Act 2 Night crashes normally, but if you modify the files to access it, you'll see that it's completely empty and is very dark for whatever reason. Savannah Citadel Act 1 is very interesting. Its layout is from a very early build, with many remnants of a completely different level model. Well, actually, that model is present in the game files. It's the same version that is shown in multiple pre-release screenshots and early trailers for the game, looking for the most part completely different from the final. The 3D sections are largely different, and only the 2D ones somewhat resemble the finalized version. This is also one of the holy grails of Sonic Cut levels, as you can see an instance of the stage that is almost completely different compared to what we actually got to see. Act 2 is normally devoid of any objects, however there's a leftover layout that doesn't get loaded normally, which has a lot of obstacles, causing massive frame drops at specific points. Acts 3 and 4 mostly only have incomplete layouts, either making them impossible to beat or just harder to do so. There's an early layout for Savannah Citadel Act 1 Night that normally doesn't get loaded by the prototype. It has a lot of untextured objects and an earlier goal ring. The terrain around the middle of the level is also different, having more support beams instead of a bottomless pit. It's clear that some objects don't match the stage model anymore. Act 4 Night also has a very unfinished layout, with untextured items and many buttons. The poles here, besides also having no textures, are sometimes placed diagonally, something that is never seen in the final game. If you place this layout over Act 1, you can see that it loosely lines up with it, in what is an early version of the level with no puzzles yet and a different stage model probably. Act 2 Night is also very early and incomplete, and there are these odd little diamonds instead of platforms. All Cool Edge acts seem to be mostly final or don't feature any objects, no in between almost. Rooftop Run Act 3 has an extremely early layout with a lot of untextured platforms. Instead of there actually being chow, they're represented by 2 overlapping rings, however collecting them still counts towards the objective. Act 4 has no arrow chasers or auto running, meaning it doesn't work as intended. Act 5 only has spinners, with the layout ending halfway through the stage. Act 1 Night is also pretty incomplete. It has a goal ring right at the start, and most objects are missing. Also, there are random buildings loaded throughout the normal level path, which are only meant to be loaded as scenery when you enter the tower. However, they're always loaded here. Act 2 Night crashes when you move forwards, which makes it pretty hard to tell what the differences are. While they don't really matter, it's pretty weird that this even happens. Dragon Road Act 4 is also a pretty weird one. It's much shorter and easier than the final, has a placeholder goal ring right at the start, and has a ton of placeholder platforms. However, not all objects and gimmicks behave how you'd expect them to, meaning they'll send you to your death most times. Act 1 Night has an unused layout dated from the 9th of June 2008. It's mostly just an early version missing some objects and enemies. However, this stage has an area that goes completely unused in the final game, which would only be used later for DLC stages. Here, that area is much more developed than the rest of the stage, which is a bit strange. Act 2 Night's layout is pretty early, with untextured platforms, no enemies, and a gold ring right at the start. At this point, the keystone can't be carried across the beams for whatever reason. There's also only one. And Tornado Defense Act 1 has 3 layouts, though the most interesting one is the normal, as it's called, having a lot of enemies present, making it basically impossible to complete since you don't have much time to kill them. Now let's take a look at the final game. Most of these layouts are remnants from the before mentioned prototype, so yeah, this game was meant to have hard and very hard versions of its levels, much like Sonic 06, probably as DLC. As such, there are multiple layouts left over in the game's files which are early versions of these. However, most of these layouts are incomplete and only go so far, while the remaining few are near complete. In an effort of fulfilling this vision, Rotten Mind ported these layouts to the actual game, both the console versions and the recompilation. Of course, since none of them are complete, they are to a certain point made up of imagination and mixing both remnants of the hard and very hard hard layouts together. So if you want a different and harder Sonic Unleashed experience, make sure to check it out. At the end of Arid Sands Act 1 Night is a sealed door. If you go past it using a combo and a water barrel, you can access this unused canyon area. If you go deeper, you'll enter another pretty big area which goes completely unused. It would lead all the way up to the Gaia Temple, weren't it for the missing objects to bridge the gap between the furthest you can go and the rest of the geometry. This area was eventually used for the DLC's Act 2. However, the area with these two pillars, which can only be found here in the entire game, goes unused there as well. Similarly, a closed door is present in the final room of Jungle Joyride Act 1 Night. Clipping through it will reveal an empty chamber in the normal stage. However, if you access it through the ghost mission, the door will be open and there are many objects inside. There's a tree that can be knocked to form a bridge, floating platforms and switches that raise the water level. The latter are mostly functional, as the platforms and the kill plane rise, but the actual water graphics are stationary. This area was eventually used for the DLC's Act 3. Savannah Citadel Act 1 Night also has something like this. Right at the start of the level, if you clip through this wall, there's a sort of sculpture inside with some wooden crates, most likely pertaining to an early version of the level. Savannah Citadel Act 1 Day has some remnants of the early version found in the August prototype. Except it isn't. It's an even earlier version of that, as it doesn't match up with the stage geometry at all, yet clearly belongs to the tree climb section. Act 2 for this stage has 3 unused layouts, all of which are pretty strange. The first one contains flamethrowers on the floor and 3 tall rings of spikes. The ramps in the middle lead to a platform lined up with springs. The second is similar to the first, but the positioning of the obstacles is a bit different. Also, instead of springs, there are spikes now. And the third has spikes on the floor and crushing platforms above them, with yet another different flamethrower positioning. Dragon Road Act 1 Night has an early layout that predates the August preview build, containing many placeholder grabbable objects and even vertical swinging poles. Arid Sands Act 1 Day has a layout that is pretty close to the final. You might be wondering, well, didn't you say you wouldn't cover stages like this? Yeah, I did. However, the stage is only similar to the final to a point, as near the wall running section, the layout completely disconnects from the terrain, suggesting that this ending area was very different at some point. The night counterpart of the level also has an early layout, which, similar to the beta Dragon Road Act 1 Night layout, the beta area seems to be much more developed than the rest of the stage. The Play It Cool mission for Skyscraper Scamper has an early layout that spans the entire act. The most interesting thing here is that it spawns the unused Javelin object. Weirdly, this is only accessible in the Xbox 360 version, as the PS3 completely blocks it off. Jungle Joyride Act 1 Day has a much harder layout than the final, with many more flamethrowers on the water. It also disconnects from the terrain at some point, suggesting a different level design. And Act 2 Night has an early object layout which has you using dark frights instead of dark bats to cross, with far fewer enemies and even some bombs, which are an object that goes completely unused normally. Did you know that there is a leftover unused texture that features early names for the stages in the game? While some of these are identical to the final, namely Dragon Road, Jungle Joyride, Skyscraper Scamper and Eggman Land, all other ones are different. Windmill Isle was called White Island, Rooftop Run was Orange Roofs, which is the Japanese name for the level. Savannah Citadel was Cray Castle, most likely a typo and meant to be Clay Castle, and Arid Sands was Hot Desert. Following the same logic, it was definitely meant to be named Hot Desert. There are also early graphics for the boss title cards, showing that every single name was different. If you follow the same logic as the levels, it can be inferred that the names are presented in the same order the bosses show up in the game, but since we don't know if the order was different, this can't be confirmed. We're not done with in-game content yet, as we still have to look at the Wii and PS2 versions. While no prototypes of it have ever been found, the final game itself has a lot of remnants of early iterations of these stages. Inside the texture archive for Dark Gaya's running sections are some tree textures with the NYC prefix. NYC is the internal name given to Empire City in the HD version, meaning that the level was probably planned for this game at some point. If you don't know, both this level and Missouri don't exist here. Some levels in this game have unused layouts outside of the normal stage barriers, featuring some rings, enemies, and sometimes even goal rings. There is a lot of stuff that isn't that interesting really, but are remnants of early layouts for these stages. The Storm also has a pretty detailed video on this, so definitely check it out. If you're familiar with this game, you're aware that the daytime stages only have like 1 or 2 areas, while the nighttime levels are gigantic and feature numerous areas. Well, from what can be seen by exploring some layouts and out-of-bounds stuff, it seems that the day stages were actually meant to be longer, but are usually only used for small missions despite being loaded into the actual main stages. Arid Sands has a second act that would utilize a sand buggy, similar to the bobsled in Cool Edge. This is playable in the Last Time Attack mission. Dragon Road's second act would have an area that looks very different compared to the main one, taking place in dragon-shaped mountains, a bamboo swamp, and a 2D area where you run alongside a cliff. Rooftop Run features 2 areas. The first takes place in the aqueducts, which is used in the Final Time Attack mission. What's weird about this one is that mission uses a replica of the normal stage except for the final part, which uses this otherwise completely unused segment, and the other in the sewers of the ring mission. It seems that both sections would connect similarly to the skydiving section in the HD version, as the level model does have an entrance with arches resembling those of the aqueduct. The second day map for Jungle Joyride is heavily incomplete, and has pretty large unfinished or missing sections. From what is suggested in the game files, it was meant to feature 4 areas, yet the third one is missing terrain and is simply a flat plane collision. The first area takes place on cliffside ruins, the second on crystal-coated caves, and the fourth is in a long twisting path surrounded by waterfalls in a jungle. However, the second area ends in a closed-off room, so how it would have connected to the third missing section is anyone's guess. Some missions have you play through large parts of these sections, but not ever their entirety. Past these bars at the end of Area A is another seemingly unused segment that would have connected to Area B. Similarly, some Werehog stages were also meant to be one single massive stage, like the HD version, instead of multiple smaller ones. This is similar to Sonic Colors, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But before that, let's take a look at some concept art and pre-release material. Of course, there are multiple screenshots of Savannah Citadel Act 1 in unknown areas. The official unveiling trailer for the game also features a version of Windmill Isle that is completely different from any act present in the final game. Concept art of Apotos depicts it mostly how it looks in the final game. However, instead of only blue and red, there would have also been yellow doors, and the area could have looked much rockier at some point, as well as some ancient ruins and statues being included, which look very nice. Artwork for Spagonia shows that the structures would have been much larger compared to Sonic, including arched passageways and longer narrow paths compared to those in the final game. There are also 3D render concepts of it for the Wii version, showing a much larger and grandiose university area. Rooftop Run itself would have also featured wooden bridges and such, looking much more rustic. Chunan would have apparently been next to a massive waterfall, with the area being much darker as a result. Here is a skyscraper scamper that looks much taller and grandiose compared to the one from the final game. There's artwork for Jungle Joyride that shows Sonic running on a tree branch that connects to a temple, something that is never seen in the game. And Eggman Land was originally meant to look much more industrial and bleaker, whereas in the final it goes for an amusement park yet still industrial theming. Some concepts made by Studio Aoki also exist, though the most interesting ones are for Jungle Joyride, since they depict a massively different iteration of the stage. Instead of being mostly a beach area, it seems that the intention was for it to take place inside the jungle, going through temples and some mysterious looking trees. And that's about it for Sonic Unleashed. Now let's take a look at Sonic Colors. Inside the game files lies a file called ActStageMission.lua, which features some developer notes to identify each level layout. What's interesting here is that the names given to some stages appear to be early iterations and have a lot of details about them. Present in basically every single stage described here are lines identifying either Acts 1 and 2 or Acts 1 and 4 as first half of Old Act 1 and second half of Old Act 1, and sometimes there is also supposed to be an Old Act 2 that was eventually divided into Acts 3 and 5 for example, though for most instances Act 2 is still whole. This suggests that at some point, levels like Planet Wisp Acts 1 and 4 were supposed to be a single massive stage, instead of 2 separate stages. Well, that can actually still be corroborated by the level geometry, for all stages in fact, excluding Starlight Carnival. By hacking the game, you can skip the goal ring or end capsules at the end of Act 1 of a given stage and see a little bit of level geometry from either Act 2 or 4, depending on which one is is the continuation. Except I'm kind of lying, because you can't just see a little bit. You can see the entire stage model, which is still loaded by the game despite being devoid of any objects. The collision is still present and rails work, but besides that there's nothing to see. The presence of this suggests that the decision to split the levels was made in the latter half of development, as the developers either didn't bother to or didn't have time to remove the remaining geometry. Why this was done is anyone's guess. It doesn't seem to be for performance reasons, since the game runs fine on the Wii by having all of that geometry loaded, and the objects aren't all loaded at the same time. This means that the most plausible reason is that it was probably done to pad out the game's length. So basically, Tropical Resort Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 2, while Act 2 became Act 3. Sweet Mountain Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 2, and Act 2 was split into Acts 3 and 5. Planet Wisp Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 4, while Act 2 became Act 6. Aquarium Park Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 4, while Act 2 became Act 6. And lastly, Asteroid Coaster Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 2, while Act 2 became Act 6. Starlight Carnival and Terminal Velocity did not see any act split, though the former's Act 2 became Act 5, and the latter's files indicate that an Act 3 was cut. Note that the DS version is structured almost identically to this. Every area has 2 acts, a boss, and 3 side missions. Sorry for saying Act too many times. This game also has 6 unused levels for Gameland present in the files, in varying degrees of completeness. These are stages A20, C20, C30, E10, F10 and F20. Stage A20 is probably the most complete of the group, with only one small camera bug remaining. This stage makes use of the spikes wisp inside the large maze structure. Stage C20 seems more like a rough draft, having obvious misalignments and lacking smooth camera triggers. This stage provides the drill wisp to speed through some dirt. Stage C30 is an easier stage, with one small spikes wisp climb segment. Stage E10 contains a rail section, rocket wisp sections and a quick step section. Stage F10 starts with a bare quick step road, then transitions into a water area. The largest water zone contains a bug that doesn't allow you to use the drill wisp. Stage F20 is probably the largest of the group, but improper camera triggering in water makes it nearly impossible to complete, and there is a laser robot chase that acts as the final area. While the original Sonic Colors didn't feature any test stages left over in its files, Colors Ultimate does for whatever reason. They do come from the original game though, since they are inside the Sonic 2010 folder in the files, which is where all the Wii assets are located. Since these can never be found in the Wii version, it's deductible that Blind Squirrel was given an early or development build of the game and left these in accidentally. Most information about them is in a file called testmission.lua, and they're not a one-to-one replica of the Wii stages because they add Jade Wisp anchors and other stuff that wasn't in the original game. There's a mod that restores them by M&M for Ultimate, and another mod that backports them to the Wii version by Death, so a big shout out to them. The first stage is Stage 901, or Object Test Map. This level is used to test various objects and their functions in the game. Sadly, there isn't much to it. This is probably the only situation where you can use the cube wisp in 3D, which is weird considering that you can't use any other wisp here that is only used in 2D in the regular stages. The second stage is Stage 902, or Nishimura Test Map. This Nishimura is actually referencing Makiko Nishimura, not Masato Nishimura, which is infamous due to being responsible for the Infinite Fun screen in Sonic CD, as well as working on games like Shenmue and Virtua Fighter. Makiko Nishimura was a lead programmer for a lot of different Sonic games starting in SA2 Battle, being the lead character programmer in Colors, so it's likely that this level was created by her. This test level is used to test the drill wisp's functionality, the drifting mechanism, interactions with slopes, boxes and skydiving. Once again, there isn't much to it. The third stage is Stage 905, or Multi-Object Test Map. Once again, nothing very interesting, it's just a stage used for testing multiplayer objects. The fourth stage is Stage 904, or Enemy Test Map. It's used to test various enemies such as the Chaser, Motora and Big Chaser, resulting in some of the hardest and most intense sequences in any Sonic game to this day. The fifth stage is Stage 906, or Sugawara Test Map. The only things I could find about a Sugawara that worked on Sonic games was Fumikazu Sugawara, which was the lead designer for Sonic Blast, and Makoto Sugawara, which only provided development support for Sonic Origins, so I don't know who it is referencing. Well, actually, it seems that Makoto Sugawara specifically asks not to be credited, so it's probably referencing him. The stage itself, though, is a variation of Stage 902, Nishimura Test Map. The differences here is that the ring object is removed, there are 3 more super rings, and removes the phantom collision that was present there. The sixth and last stage is Stage 999, or For Confirmation Test. This test level is likely used as a load test, as there is nothing here besides 4 platforms, 3 of which are inaccessible due to an invisible wall, and a rail that takes you nowhere. there. Finally, let's take a look at some concept art and pre-release material. Sadly, it seems that most concept art for the game actually looks like the final game, except for Starlight Carnival, where although the aesthetic is the same, the floating roads seem to be made of glass and there's some sort of electric trap placed along it. Asteroid Coaster, which features artwork with some sort of twisting bone path, and Planet Wisp being the most different. It seems that the level wouldn't be as industrial, and would even feature much more water than what can be seen in the final game. It seems that you would actually go to the area where the giant robot excavator is located, whereas in the final you can only see it from a distance. There would also be these arms shooting a mist of some kind, and there were meant to be paths where you'd even go under the trees for a more atmospheric set piece. And that's it for colors. Time for generations now. This game sadly doesn't have anything regarding early level stuff, both in the final game or in any demo we have access to, meaning we'll really only take a look at concept art. Except, well, there is something, especially regarding a scrapped PSP version. In 2021, Obscure Gamers released a number of textures from a game called Sonic Anniversary, which is the development name for Sonic Generations. This data was present inside the UMD, the PSP's disk format. Only 14 megabytes of data could be retrieved, considering the disk's permanently unsalvageable state. Among assets and the bare-bones debug menu, level textures for what appears to be Mushroom Hill were found. Sadly, that's all that was found. As for concept art, Green Hill features some interesting design choices. There would be this big room with giant totems on the walls, as well as this rail in a chasm really high up, which doesn't really fit the stage theming. Concepts for rails also show that they could have been branches and vines at some point. Here is a new chemical plant artwork using classic sprites, with some sort of watchtowers in the background, and instead of taking place at night, it would have been at dawn or dusk apparently. Concept art for Sky Sanctuary is probably my favorite out of any Sonic game, not only because all of them look absolutely beautiful, but the level was going for more of a garden vibe, with a lot more vegetation, water, and an even bigger ethereal feel. Speed Highway has a concept that looks a bit different to what Speed Highway ever looked like, most likely due to the color scheme. And lastly, here's a very different look at the Egg Dragoon fight, which would have transparent walls showing what appears to be the Dark Gaia cavern at the end of Unleashed. Now time for Sonic Lost World, which does feature more stuff than Generations. Since I already covered this in my Lost World Cut content video, I'll cover it in a similar fashion. Much like Colors, this game also features the ActStageMission.lua file. Much like that game, this one also features very interesting early details about the levels in the game. Firstly, there is a leftover entry for Act 1 of Tropical Resort left over in the file. This entry specifically features some changes made for the format used for the Lost World Lua parser, while still retaining some values exclusive to the Colors format, which just makes the situation weirder. There are also a few test levels from Colors that were seemingly reused in Lost Worlds. The only notable difference here is the inclusion of the Asteroid Wisp within these stages. These seem to be the same test stages present in that game, as they feature the exact same name and title, such as Stage 905 being Multi-Object Test Map. There are also several levels that were removed from the game, which entries are still present in this Lua file. These are stages AO2, AO3, AO4 and AO5 for Desert Ruins, translated to Sky Chase, Ancient City, Japanese Spider Crab and Inside the Sandworm Body respectively. Stage AO7 for Tropical Coast, translated to Tropical Beach 2, which is the name given to the final's first act. Stages AO2, AO5 and CO1 for Windy Hill, translated to Windy Cave, which is the name given to the final's act 3, Moai and Quinto Un, as in the Flying Nimbus from Dragon Ball respectively. And stages AO2 and AO3 for Frozen Factory, translated to Windy Cave 2 and Ilo Milo Suites, which are the name given to the final Silent Forest Act 3 and Desert Ruins Act 3 respectively. Another file called testmission.lua is present in the files, much like Sonic Colors Ultimate. Similar to that game, this one appears to have a bunch of test levels removed from the game, which would have been present inside a folder named test in the root of the file system. Some of these entries are using the naming scheme from Colors for stage names, being Stage 101 for example, while others are named according to the scheme standardized in Lost World, being something like W1AO1. All of these entries have mission tests written in English to identify them, but some do feature text in Japanese for more specific descriptions, such as Collision Test Map, Shooting Studio, or Design Test Map 2 Dark Sides. Interestingly, these entries mention wisps not present in the game at all, only being used in colors, such as Spike for Spikes, Puzzle for Cube, and Rodeo for Frenzy. Another interesting file is left over in the game, called ActStageData.lua. This file reveals what the game's original level order was supposed to be like, with which is very interesting. Many of the level entries here feature a ton of levels that have been removed from the game, more specifically the ones I mentioned a bit ago. Even then, there are plenty of changes that we can dissect in this list. For Windy Hill, the sequence starts off just like the final, but swiftly changes gears by heading into AO2 instead of AO3. I'll be omitting the W1, W2, etc. parts of the names as it just makes things more confusing, though I can quickly explain what that is. It's meant to identify what act belongs to each stage, or world in the naming's case. You can see on the screen which number belongs to each stage, so it's easier to understand, though not every stage follows this format exactly, for reasons we're gonna see now. Anyways, checking the description of the AO2 level, it matches up with the final game's Act 3, suggesting the two stages are the same. However, their starting positions don't line up at all. The following level is AO3, meaning Act 3 and 2 were likely swapped early in development. The order continues with AO4, which is used as Sky Road Act 1 in the final, weirdly enough. This suggests that this level was meant to be used in Windy Hill, which is supported by the fact that the level shares a very similar look with that area, reusing a bunch of level geometry. AO5 shares its description with Silent Forest Act 4, suggesting that, like the previous stage, it was to come much sooner into the game. However, once again, the starting positions are hugely different. Interestingly, looking at the final Silent Forest Act 4 data, there are a few leftover objects in the sky around the cut AO5 spawn position. The spawn position being so close to the goal ring means the level was more than likely supposed to start close to its end. Finally, for Windy Hill, there's CO1. Taking note of the change from A to C, it seems that this level wasn't meant to be a normal act, rather a challenge level. Looking at the description once again, it reveals that this level is none other than Hidden World Act 1. However, there's a small difference in starting locations. This leaves the final game's second encounter with Zaz in Act 4 nowhere to be seen, as it is referred to in the finals files as AO6, which doesn't exist in the original level order. Desert Ruins also starts very strong, just like the final, but goes immediately into AO2 instead of XPO1, which is the Beehive level in the final. Checking the description of the level, it matches up with Hidden World Act 2. The entry for AO2 also features the Sky Chase tag, meaning that it would also be a level in the tornado just like the final game. Interestingly, Cut Test Level Stage 823 has a Japanese comment which references this level, translating to World 22 Diameter 20 meter test. AO3, AO4 and AO5 are all scrap levels I covered earlier, with no counterpart in the final game, being the Ancient City, Japanese Spider Crab and Sandworm Body stages. CO1 is the final level of the original order for Desert Ruins, but it's actually used as Sky Road Act 4 in the final game. The aesthetics of the area do match up with the look of Desert Ruins, so it's likely that this level really was supposed to be there originally. The description of the level roughly translates to Yellow Triple Spring, meaning it was probably going to function like the Yellow Spring levels from Colors, as the moving springs in the level behave very similarly to those. From here on out, the original level order becomes very segmented, with barely any trace left of it. For Tropical Coast, the only unseen level is AO7, which does not have a counterpart in the final game. It has the same description as Act 1, which does go used in the final, with a 2 at the end of it, which, as I've said before, probably means that it was supposed to be a continuation of the level. Frozen Factory starts the same as the final, with the first level being AO1, though the second level is AO2 instead of AO4. However, checking the description of the stage, it matches up with Silent Forest Act 3, meaning that they're the same level. The third level is AO3 instead of X-Casa 1, which is the casino stage. The description of this level matches up with Desert Ruins Act 3, weirdly enough. The letter's configuration file is still called w4ao3_config.lua. However, the brief section states it's a configuration file for w2ao5. The interesting part is that neither of these exist in the final game. Silent Forest only has AO1 in its entries, which is the final's Act 1. Sky Road has AO3 and AO5. AO3 is the secret level of Tropical Coast in the final game. As most of Sky Road's levels seem to come from elsewhere, it's hard to make a proper judgment on whether the stage would aesthetically belong in Sky Road or not, but it does play very similarly to Sky Road Act 3. Its config file also states that the stage does belong to Sky Roads. I guess I didn't really explain that some stages, such as this one, are identified as belonging to World 6, which is Sky Road here, but belong to stages such as Tropical Coast, which is World 3. This happens because the original level order was changed, if you didn't guess by now. Looking at the final game's levels, there seems to be a gap of missing stages that aren't referenced in the original level order. For Tropical Coast, AO2, AO4 and CO1 are nowhere to be seen. It's possible that these levels were turned into those that don't start with a world number, or that they didn't even exist to begin with. Interestingly, test level W0AO4 has the following comment, which is about the cut level AO5, roughly translating to Side View Casino Test. This means that this level could have turned into Frozen Factory Act 3 later in development. Frozen Factory specifically doesn't feature AO5 AO5 and CO1 anywhere. Silent Forest doesn't feature AO4, AO5, AO6 or CO1. AO3 is actually the second level of Sky Road in the final game, which does match up with the aesthetic of the stage. And lastly, Lava Mountain doesn't feature any levels in this Lua file, possibly meaning it hadn't been planned yet. Now, concept art time. What's interesting about the Lost World concepts is that they even feature development comments. Most of the concepts sadly resemble what is seen in the final. Windy Hill was meant to have a gimmick where the terrain rotated like gears in different directions. Tropical Coast has a concept where Sonic can be seen with his classic design from Generations. Whether this means the game was meant to be a classic Sonic game is anyone's guess, but the aesthetic does match up. Concepts for the casino stage showed that it would have been much bluer, which was changed because it could make it hard to see where Sonic was. And Silent Forest doesn't seem to feature the mushrooms at this point, though the concept resembles the final. And that's it for Lost World. Now let's take a look at Sonic Mania. An early version of Green Hill Zone Act 1 is left over inside the cutscene files for the scene where you get teleported there by the Phantom Ruby. While you only get to see the starting area, the entire early level is loaded, with the actual final stage being loaded when you gain control of Sonic. Differences here include 3 removed giant ring positions. The first one is really obvious, the second features a tunnel that was eventually removed, with the other one that is still present having a different shape, and the third one was later used in Encore mode. Some of the lake areas look incomplete at this point. It seems that there was another giant ring around this part too. The cutscene that plays after you defeat a Death Egg robot in Act 2 also loads an early version of the map. While it looks mostly identical to the final, it still needed some visual touch-ups. An early version of Studiopolis Zone Act 1 is also left over, similar to the one that was playable at PAX 2016. Similarly, an early iteration of Lava Reef Act 1 is present. This one is different in the sense that it's comprised of sections from both Sonic and Knuckles and others that are Mania exclusive. However, the graphics are loaded incorrectly for the most part. It also makes use of the turrets and lava falls that go unused in the final. In the files for Angel Island Act 1 is a part of that stage from Christian Whitehead's Sonic 3 and Knuckles Retro Engine version. It includes all of the original layout, although with different graphics since it calls for tile locations that are different in Mania. The same goes for Act 2 of the same stage, with the result being less than pretty to look at. And there's a leftover test level for Angel Island, meant to test cutscenes, enemies and gimmicks. There are also some cut bonus stages. 3 of them are called Scene Test, yet appear final and function correctly but go unused for whatever reason. And the other, called Scene 33, is very clearly a test level, composed of a large area full of blue spheres. As for unused stage graphics, Studiopolis has an unused boss. Its eyes represent a game of rock paper scissors, where you had to touch its button and try to win against him. Flying Battery has some assets which actually pertain to Wing Fortress. However, these two specifically go unused. Press Garden has 3 big cyan, magenta and yellow ink jars, larger than the ones that can actually be seen in the game. When Tails or Knuckles enter them, they'll be colored with the tint of the jar, however nothing happens to Sonic. There's a high-speed ink wiper too, which would seemingly remove the ink, but all functionality has been removed. There are also 2 printer objects, the SP500 Mark I and Mark II. The former has an opening at the top. If you try to go inside it normally, you'll be simply shot from the bottom. If you're covered in ink, however, the printer drops down and puts you in a random place. It's obvious that most functionality is gone. It appears that this one at least would send you to a specific point in the stage depending on the ink color. The latter, however, has a button on the top for you to operate. It pauses for a bit, then goes from one side of the rail to the other. An object called acetone is also present, which would spray acetone to remove the ink from the character. Lava Reef has spiked platforms on conveyor belts from the original level which don't make an appearance here. Well, they kinda do, but only if you access the low layer of Act 2, being corrupted. There's also a giant chain link, which is presumed to be part of a cut stage transition between this one and Metallic Madness. Considering how the background of the stage is Little Planet, it would probably be somewhat inspired on the intro sequence for Sonic CD. And that's it for the final game. Now let's take a look at some pre-release material and concept art. In May 2017, a poster for a Sega meeting at a Las Vegas licensing expo used a screenshot of what was an unseen Mania level at the time. In hindsight, it's clear that this is Press Garden Act 1. However, there are no press-themed tiles, and the level has a distinct sunny summer look. In fact, the level was once called Pulp Solstice, which does fit this aesthetic better, since during the transition from Act 1 to 2, a solstice would take place, Act 1 in the summer and Act 2 in the winter. The area shown in the screenshot doesn't exist in the final game. And for concept art, the only interesting one we have really is this one for the special stage, showing 2 unused mechanics. One where the UFO would drop bombs in your path, and another one where, once you collected the Chaos Emeralds, you'd have to run away from the UFO for a specific amount of time, where a gun barrel would come out of its bottom and shoot projectiles at you. There's the remnant of this mechanic as an unused graphic in the game files. That's it for Mania. Now let's take a look at Sonic Forces. Inside the game's files is a leftover title screen saying Sonic 2017 VR demo version, second ROM confidential. While this is most likely a joke of some kind, this kind of ties in with the leftover unused object layout for Sunset Heights, which brings us to that. This layout is pretty weird in the sense that it plays itself, much like the rest of the game. Well, I mean that Sonic actually moves on its own always. This is internally called W3V01. Once again, W for World 3, so the city area, yet the VID is never used for any other layout in the game. It could be presumed that maybe it would have been used for this VR demo. Sunset Heights, Park Avenue and Redgate Bridge were supposed to be one long stage, as evidenced by leftover layouts. Considering the overall layout and the presence of Redgate Bridge's QuickTime event, all of it was most likely a tag team stage. Also, there are enemies, wire targets and rings placed outside of the normal 2D section geometry, suggesting that the stage was much larger on top of adding the rest of Redgate Bridge's terrain. Sunset Heights also has another object layout from much earlier in development. It desyncs with the terrain at some point, so it's anyone's guess what this was used for. Most likely a different stage model at that point. This is very well known but still relevant. The unused audio calls for null space. The level was meant to start further back, revealing a quick step section before the double boost, as well as some lines Sonic never says in the final stage.
A prison that goes on forever, huh? At least getting sent here taught me something. Nothing beats realizing that you're not alone.
Mortar Canyon was originally going to be harder and less automated. There are less rings and dash pads, to a point at least, more enemies, obstacles and platforms, and some camera angles were more cinematic. There are actually platforming segments here that don't exist in the final at all, which are pretty challenging. Luminous Forest has a layout from very early in development, not having much besides some enemies, rings and dash pads, although being harder than the final starting sequence. There are 3 test layouts left over in the files, although no geometry for them. One of these even features the unused grapple point variant for the avatar, which works similarly to the swinging bars. Opening it up in a hex editor shows that there are multiple objects referenced which can't be seen due to not being in the files anymore, such as a balloon, the dummy spring and 2 enemy types, namely the crab meat and some other named Potos Red. Another extremely early layout doesn't match up with any particular level, consisting only of rings and silver egg pawns. Upon further inspection, it seems that it's actually for Sunset Heights and Park Avenue, being impossible to complete however. There's also an unused layout for enemy territory featuring a vastly different 2D section from the one seen in the final game. An early Sunset Heights screenshot is left over in the files for some reason. Here it's pretty clear that the lighting is much brighter and unfinished compared to the final. Most particle effects are completely missing, details on the roads and buildings are also not here, and the buildings alongside the road are different, being mostly intact. The bridge in the distance is undamaged too and seems to be using a placeholder texture. Additionally, the camera angle used here is different from the one in the final, matching some of the early Sunset Heights layouts. Though not really unused, Final Judgment has a unique skybox that can never be seen, since you're indoors the entire time. Now let's take a look at some concept art. Artwork for the city level shows how much bleaker it was meant to be like, as literally everything would be in flames and destroyed, barely even resembling a city anymore. There's another concept for it that looks more like the final does. Others show it to look much more like a European city, similar to Spagoni in a sense, with some robots taking over, as well as it being located in the mountains, either with large stone buildings on the coast or mushroom-shaped houses. Green Hill would have also been much darker, transformed into some kind of prison, as evidenced by the barbed wire and the gigantic walls. It also has an abandoned and withered look with dead plants and a bunch of cobwebs. Lost Valley specifically would have featured dark grey paths instead of green. Concept art for Null Space shows Infinite in it, possibly meaning that there would be some scene or fight with him there. Artwork for Mystic Jungle has the same aesthetic, but it looks different, mainly because it has buildings and other structures which are never seen in the final, as that stage typically uses ruins in the background. Finally, Eggman Empire Fortress could have been some kind of floating island, with Eggman's army consisting of tanks, soldier egg pawns, choppers and other aircraft. While this game has a bunch of stuff regarding cutscenes, QTEs and boss patterns, there's not much regarding levels. However, there are of course the unused open zone layouts. During development, Chronos, Ray and Oranos Islands were all originally the same landmass. This can be seen as late as the announcement trailer from December 2021, where it showcases the finals Ray and Oranos Islands despite supposedly only revealing Chronos. Apparently, the change was made because playtesters thought the island was too big and boring. While Oranos was removed from the main island model, Chronos and Ray are still connected and both are loaded when you access either of them, however you can't actually access the other. Their minimaps are also the same, just cropped differently. In one of Eggman's memos, he also refers to the Starfall Islands as 3, not 5. The split can even be seen in-game if you go very high up, as the outline of the terrain is reflected on the water, which is brighter where the island was meant to be. Also, only the PS4 and Switch versions include an early height map for Chronos, which clearly includes all islands before the split. This map also has two unused object layouts. The first is very early and empty, having all 7 Chaos Emeralds and Giganto in the place of Supreme, and the second is much closer to the final, having the same objects and bosses. However, it features several rail generator puzzles, while the final only has one. Also, there's an unused early wind map for Chronos Island. However, this depicts an even earlier version of the island, featuring other smaller islands that can't be seen in the early height map. This early version can also be seen in the leaked footage that also contained the Jet Set Radio remake and Persona 3 reloads. Chronos is clearly in its unsplit state, and even larger than the one seen in the early height map, suggesting that the version there is the one suggested by the wind map. A floating structure can also be seen in the background that was completely removed from the final. Giganto itself has the same design, however the boss arena is in a completely different place, being in a forested area of what seems to be Oranos Island. It seems that this is where the Supreme boss takes place in the final game, being surrounded by fog with a different skybox, none of which make an appearance in the game. The Caterpillar mini-boss can also be seen in what would become Raya Island, while the final only has it in Oranos. Similarly, if you go high enough in Aris Island, you can see an outline of what was another iteration of it, a much larger one at that. On the same note, an early wind map for Chaos Island shows that it would have also been much larger and would have more small islands. Now let's take a look at pre-release material and concept art. In Chaos Island, there was supposed to be a segment where you explored an abandoned factory that mass-produced copies of Giganto, as corroborated by the concept art and confirmed by game director Morio Kishimoto. Chronos Island looks very similar to the final in terms of concepts. However, it seems that the zone was meant to be more of a meadow than anything, with some large ruins in the distance like the final, but less obstacles and terrain variation. Another shows it with many more bodies of water and even small waterfalls, with Giganto looming in the distance. And concepts for Aris Island depict the area in various forms, one more canyon-like and another resembling more a desert. The final version is sort of a mix of both, of course. One of these also uses Sonic's model from 06. Finally, for this video, let's take a look at shadow generations. At the time of making this video, there's still a lot to be discovered most likely, so just know that what I'm about to cover is probably not all that's in the game. At this point, only a single early layout has been found, for Space Colony Arc Act 1, W01A10, while the finals is W01A11. It was repurposed for the Sonic vs Shadow cutscene, yet it features small differences from the final one, like extended and missing terrain, different routes and different rails at the beginning. There are also lots of development stages listed in the game's master.levels file. They're listed as being in the stage/develop directory, yet all of them are missing. And that's about it for this video. There are many more spin-offs that feature stuff like test stages and different concepts, but none that I thought too interesting to warrant a coverage, sadly. Exploring cut and unused levels is one of the most interesting things regarding cut content in general. While you're familiar with what ended up being released, seeing how development progressed and what the developers had in mind for the stage gives you a sort of new perspective on these games. While the final product tends to be polished and seamless to a degree, it's cool to see that it wasn't like that all the time, and how these layouts and concept arts show or suggest iterations of these levels that are very different to what we got to see. Some make the final version a bit of a disappointment, others make you glad that they went unused. But all in all, it's something that's really cool. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, as these videos take a lot of time to write, record, edit, plan, you name it. So I'd be very grateful. You can also support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships to get early access to videos and your name in the screen at the end, as well as follow me on Twitter if you want, and check out my community tab once in a while where I post quite frequently with video news. And that's about it really. I'll hopefully see you soon.